Aaron, where are you? Where is Aaron right now? You done messed up, Aaron!
Aaron is right here, everyone. Welcome back for more SPTV, where every day is a great day not to be in a cult. This is an interview I did with Jordan Horan, a master's level psychologist out of Michigan. Jordan came on my radar when he showed up to a city council meeting where Scientology was trying to get the council to pass a resolution declaring March 13th L. Ron Hubbard Day in recognition of the 75th anniversary of Dianetics, the modern science of mental health. Jordan's objection was that the city should not be endorsing a pseudoscientific book like Dianetics, that Dianetics is not religious scripture. It literally says in its title, the modern science of mental health, and that the city was making a grave mistake. Well, Jordan and I had a long chat about all things Dianetics and Scientology. We got into a bunch of other stuff as well. I think you guys are really going to enjoy this. Here is my chat with Jordan. So Jordan, thanks for talking with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So the other day when Jeff Breedlove was presenting his proclamation to declare March 13th, L. Ron Hubbard Day, you got up there, you did an excellent talk explaining what your thoughts were about how destructive it would be for the city council to officially honor Dianetics. I was going to say, or L. Ron Hubbard, but you really were talking specifically about Dianetics. When you were up there speaking, it really sounded like you already had somewhat of a pretty good understanding of what Dianetics is about, what it teaches, the claims that it makes, the danger of Dianetics. What experience or exposure did you already have to Dianetics and Scientology?
So actually, I do just kind of want to clarify real quick. So the city, my understanding is Scientology, the original proclamation was supposed to be for L. Ron Hubbard Day, but they changed it to recognize the book. So that's why I zeroed in on the book, is because that was what they finally capitulated towards. And
can I ask you a question about that real quick?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I was never able, the only version of the proclamation I was able to find on the news article that I saw was the one that at the end was trying to declare it L. Ron Hubbard Day. And my question is, did Scientology agree to change the request to just acknowledge the anniversary of Dianetics, or is that just something that was on the city side?
Honestly, I don't know the inner workings of the back and forth on, from the Battle Creek Scientology's group in the city. All I really know about the inner workings are what was reported on the news. And so when they read it, the proclamation, they did say, recognizing Dianetics. So something happened where it appears that the city actually toned down the proclamation, because the one that was read, the final proclamation, from my understanding, was like the second or third iteration of the proclamation. So there was clearly some sort of monitoring or condensing and kind of picking and choosing from the city side. Yeah. But as far as like their back and forth with the Battle Creek Scientologists, I'm not sure how that looked. So because, from what I had seen, it's like, okay, they're going to focus on Dianetics. That's where I was like, okay, well, I need to talk about this.
Right.
To go back to your question about like my experience or understanding of that, it must have been a handful of years ago. I had watched a documentary on Scientology. I don't remember the name of it. I don't really remember, but so I was familiar, and I was like, wow, this seemed like really harmful stuff. The documentary, they were talking about like the Sea Organization, just all sorts of kind of problems. And so I had some familiarity, and, since the city council stuff, I've been doing more investigation into Scientology. So I didn't have like a ton. What I did know was, one, Dianetics is not a scientifically supported treatment or anything for mental health concerns. So when I was reading the wording of the proclamation of this can cure all ills and all these kind of things, I was like, wait a minute, that's not true. That's not true. So a lot of it was, I had some background knowledge. I knew about L. Ron Hubbard. I knew he was a science fiction writer. I knew that Scientology had these interesting claims of, you know, the Galactic Confederacy and Xenu and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, okay, well, I know that they're a cult. I know Tom Cruise likes them, John Travolta, whatever. But really, I was just focusing when I was critiquing the proclamation, was focusing coming from like what I know of the science of mental health and treatments, and like arguing against the wording. But that day as well, I mean, I'll be honest, I went into the literature and I was trying to read more on Scientology. And there's not a ton of scientific literature on Scientology specifically. I found a few articles that were, one was kind of a historical scientific article looking at L. Ron Hubbard's basically strong dislike of the psychiatric profession, was one article that I was able to find, and a few others. So this is my long-winded rant of, you know, I didn't know as much as I know now and have since learned. But what I did know is that the claims that were being made to me were not based on the scientific evidence. And I thought it was harmful for the city to recognize a clearly pseudoscientific ideology, which would then maybe it could influence citizens, right? Of like, oh, the city recognizes this, so this might be a thing and it might be helpful. I find that very harmful. So, yeah, that's kind of where it came from.
I thought one of the very interesting points that you made at the council meeting was the difference between a text that is considered a religious text, you know, an article of faith, an article of belief, and a text that is pseudoscience. And I really hadn't put much thought into where Dianetics fits into that, because as a Scientologist, Dianetics and Scientology are the same thing. And yet the title of the book is Dianetics, Modern Science of Mental Health.
Yeah. And
even L. Ron Hubbard in his policies said, look, Dianetics markets to a different public than Scientology. Dianetics markets to a mental health science-oriented public, and any Scientology organization should have two separate entrances to the building. And one entrance should say Hubbard Dianetics Foundation, and the other entrance should say Church of Scientology. And, you know, so even L. Ron Hubbard recognizes that there was a need to separate these things. And so when you were like, you know, in order for something to be pseudoscience, you have to pretend it's science. And that's, it just never occurred to me, even though it's something that should have occurred to me. It never quite occurred to me in quite the precise way that it did the moment you spoke about it at the council meeting. And I was like, oh my God, if people actually tried to contact Jeff Breedlove or anyone else over there in the Office of Special Affairs at the Scientology organization in Battle Creek, I wonder how they would even answer the question of, is Dianetics a sacred religious text of Scientology? Or is it a science? Because you know what? I think most Scientologists wouldn't even understand why someone was trying to differentiate.
Yeah. And honestly, for me, when I watched some of your videos and some of the videos with Natalie and stuff, and I appreciated how much that touched you, because, you know, I'm a part-time instructor at KVCC, Kalamazoo Valley Community College, and I've taught at Ferris State University and teaching psychology courses. And all of my courses are fundamentally about teaching critical thinking skills, teaching scientific reasoning, and helping students distinguish pseudoscientific reasoning, or like characteristics of pseudoscience. So when I was speaking to the city council, I really wanted to bring that about. And I knew, again, in this claim that Scientology is like a religion. So then, you know, if you say we're a religion, you have great protection, reasonably so, right? Like that's how one of the founding principles of the United States. But my problem is like I said, and like you said, the word science is clearly in the title of the text. Once you step out of the arena of science, or out of the arena of religion, and you start making empirical claims about the world, and you start making claims that you are saying are scientifically based, you have entered the public arena, and we can then critique you and say, yes, this is true, this isn't true, and those kind of things. So I really wanted to bring that point of like, no, you can't just hide behind saying, oh, like it's religion. I really wanted to drive that point home. And again, from this, we need to be thinking about all sorts of claims that are made in the public sphere of, is this a metaphysical claim, more religiously oriented, or is this a scientific claim? Once you start talking about mental health, as a professional, I will come and say, no, like that's just not true. And, you know, cut me off if I'm rambling too much here, you know, to kind of interject in these kind of things. But one of the things that psychologists should aspirationally take to heart, in 1969, the president of the APA, George Miller, famous psychologist, he said that psychologists should give away psychology, psychological science, psychological knowledge to better the world, right? And so I take that as a personal credo. Again, that was part of his presidential address back in 1969, but it is somewhat coded in our current ethics, and I take that to heart. And so when I hear, you know, these claims of, oh, Dianetics is one way to help people with their mental health conditions, I was like, no, like full stop, that's not true. So I was coming from that background of helping the city council, helping whoever would have seen my 3 minutes there to get them to think of like, wait a minute, no, like we need to think broader than this of, no, we're not just going to let them get away with saying these things. They're making scientific claims, and therefore it's in the public arena, and therefore up for, well, in this case, it's not up for debate, but I wanted to be a voice of opposition. Mm-hmm. You know, Natalie had asked me like, what were some of my motivations? I have a problem with people making pseudoscientific claims, especially because they can be potentially harmful. You know, and one of the things I tried to articulate in my argument to the city council was this idea of opportunity costs. Mm-hmm. And opportunity costs is this idea of you go with one approach or one treatment at the expense of not getting adequate treatment. Right. So again, if the city is endorsing Dianetics, they're saying, okay, you can go with this treatment. If someone goes with Dianetics, they're missing out on getting scientifically based treatment. So to me, that's one of the problems of pseudoscience is opportunity costs. Yeah. So again, I was trying to bring all of this, my background, my understanding of the science, and pointing out pseudoscience and saying, hey, we're not going to just let people hide under this phrase of religion.
Yeah. You know, I want to stick with this this subject of pseudoscience for a little bit longer. I did an interview recently with archaeologist Flint Dibble. Are you familiar with him?
I'm not.
Are you familiar with the pseudo-archaeologist Graham Hancock?
Hancock doesn't ring a bell. I mean, I've heard of, you know, some of the other people like Ken Ham and, you know, some of those kind of they're creationists, if you will.
So Graham Hancock's, he's written a ton of books, and he's got some documentaries, not documentaries, but shows on Netflix about the ancient alien civilizations and lost, he might not talk about alien civilizations. He talks about lost ancient advanced civilizations. Okay. But he's not an archaeologist. But he's a very, very smooth talker, and he's very, very, very good with facts. And he does seem to genuinely believe the stuff that he says. Mm-hmm. Flint Dibble, on the other hand, is an actual archaeologist from Cardiff University. And these guys have been doing battle publicly recently because, you know, in order to promote these ancient advanced civilization theories, you basically have to contradict everything that modern archaeology considers evidence-based science. And when in my interview with Flint, he was talking about one of the biggest indicators of pseudoscience is when you are trying to appeal to the uneducated public to convince them of your claims instead of to your peers in the science itself. And so when you talked about like, you know, how does science advance? Like the scientific method, the peer review process, it's basically experts and scientists in the field trying to convince their fellow experts and scientists in the field that this new idea or this new finding or this new theory is actually valid, and that really only people who are already experts in the field are sort of qualified to pick this apart or pick it apart or invalidate it or validate it. And that if you're trying to go to the general public to convince them about how your new fantastic idea is the newest, truthiest idea, he goes, that's sort of the definition of pseudoscience, because you're trying to convince people who aren't really in a place to know any better whether 80% of what you're saying is bullshit. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because as I'm as Flint is explaining this, and as I hear myself re-explaining it, I'm also slightly aware of how elitist it comes across to the general public of, you're not capable of knowing the truth of this.
Yeah.
And that's why pseudoscience is so sticky with the general public, is because it actually appeals to them. You are qualified to understand the truth of this, when it's this thing of like, but if you don't know what you don't know, then you can be easily swayed by a very convincing argument. Yes. And that's what Dianetics is. It's to people who don't have any other education in, let's just say the mental sciences, because I don't know the right word to use. Dianetics can sound very convincing. Mm-hmm. And so does the Graham Hancock arguments about the lost advanced civilizations. Yep. And it's funny because I'm not even pointing fingers here. I've described myself on my channel often as someone who's very easily convinced by a very strong argument, you know? Yeah. When I watch a documentary, I go, oh my God, this is the greatest thing ever. Everyone needs to hear about this. And then I watch the documentary debunking the documentary, and I'm like, oh my God, this is the greatest thing ever. But it's like, I'm just blowing with the wind on, whichever really good argument was made most recently. And it never occurred to me until Flint said this, because I grew up in Dianetics and Scientology. L. Ron Hubbard bringing Dianetics to the public and saying, this is the new greatest thing. All of the experts are just fooling you. That was sort of my construct of what expertise was. And it never occurred to me that that's literally one of the biggest hallmarks of pseudoscience. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. And, I consider myself an amateur philosopher of science. And so we're getting to a lot of these really, really important ideas that I think we should continue to unpack here. So one, I'll make the general disclaimer, a lot of philosophy of science, a lot of philosophers have tried to find what's called the demarcation line, and it's called the demarcation problem. Like, so some people, Karl Popper, the famous philosopher of science, said that there is one characteristic that separates science from pseudoscience, and he called it the falsifiability criterion. Basically, he said that if you can't disprove something, therefore it's pseudoscience. Every claim has to be able to be tested. So, for example, if someone believes in Dianetics, and then I say, okay, well, come to my research lab and we're going to test this out. And then let's say they come to the lab and then like, oh, well, we can't actually do it because when we talk to scientists, it doesn't work. Well, then it's unfalsifiable. We can't study it. To Popper, he said that that's what distinguishes science from pseudoscience. Philosophers of science have since upgraded our thinking, and we no longer hold to that one criteria. Really, I argue along the lines of Massimo Pigliucci wrote a fantastic book called Nonsense on Stilts, and wrote an edited text called Philosophy of Pseudoscience. And a lot of philosophers now are looking at characteristics. It's like there's not one single thing that separates it, but there are red flags that are like, okay, that is a pseudoscience. Okay, that's probably science. And then there's this like borderland that kind of goes there. But what you are kind of getting at is one of the characteristics of pseudoscience. You're right about, kind of like you said, going straight to the general public versus peer review. So for my students, when I'm talking to them about the one characteristic of pseudoscience, I just say a lack of peer review peer being other scientists is a red flag of pseudoscience. You're right. Because kind of like what you said, other people, like the general public, would not have the same knowledge of psychological science as other psychological scientists, right? So it's like, I'm not going to really go to have them critique my ideas. I mean, they can. Anybody can critique any ideas. But the idea of science is it's a self-correcting mechanism where other people who are experts in the field are basically picking each other apart. Like that is one key characteristic.
So let me ask you this, because this is the I'll play devil's advocate. This is what a Scientologist would say.
Yep.
L. Ron Hubbard's so-called peers in the mental sciences, which is a joke because no one could possibly be a peer to L. Ron Hubbard. They would have seen Dianetics as a threat to everything they already believed to be true. They would have been intimidated by someone else coming along and making them all irrelevant and making every mental science prior to Dianetics basically antiquated. And they would have had a vested interest to be like, oh, this is bunk. This is bullshit. And so they never would have accepted Dianetics. This peer review process is like, they're just creating a moat around the mental health industry to prevent new entrants. And so the whole peer review process is just a scam to be able to gatekeep what people want to allow and what people don't want to allow.
And so, unpacking that, like if that, that kind of pseudoscientific argument, one, that's a conspiratorial argument, and it's based on a lot of assumptions. First, you're assuming the emotional reaction of peers, right? From what you're saying, you're assuming that other mental health professionals are somehow threatened. So it's like, okay, well, what's your evidence for that, right? That mental health professionals are threatened. So that's like one area, that kind of conspiratorial thinking. The other thing I would say is, well, they kind of should be skeptical because they're the ones who already have the knowledge that someone else is trying to enter. It would be the same thing of like, for some reason, this comes to my mind. Let's say you're a vacuum salesman and you're very, very well versed in how vacuums operate. And then someone who's outside the field comes in and just tries to tell you how vacuums operate. It's like, well, of course I'm not going to listen to them because this person is the expert. So one of the problems with pseudoscientific thinking are all these like conspiratorial escape hatches, if you will. And again, like assuming these kind of things. And again, if you start from the assumptions, which I do, that most people in the mental health field are there to help people, that we have numerous types of psychotherapies and medications used to help people, clearly there's room for various types of treatments. But it comes from within the field because other experts can understand and can demonstrate that. So like even that idea of like, oh, someone's coming from the outside, we welcome it. But scientists operate, our mindset is, you must show me. One of my favorite examples, I had a former professor when I was in graduate school in a research methods class. And he said to us, he said, science operates from the state slogan of Missouri, the show me state. You must show me, you must demonstrate to me that your claims are empirically sound. And L. Ron Hubbard did try to influence the American Psychiatric Association. It was, I believe the guy's name was Winter. Joseph Winter was an MD that Hubbard was working with. And Winter took the early manuscripts of Dianetics to American Psychiatric Association meetings, and people had reviewed it, and they're like, this clearly isn't science. Like, this is clearly just not a thing. And so they did look at his work, and they determined that it was so far removed from the current body of science why are we even going to mess with these ideas? Because this is what we know, right? So again, I like how you bring that example, because with pseudosciences, there's also that conspiratorial thinking. That's right. We could even go further, right, with big pharma. For example, Scientology really didn't like Ritalin in 1997. They didn't like Prozac, and had these big movements saying that these medications are harmful, whatnot, et cetera, et cetera. What I would say to someone with that claim of like big pharma and these kind of things is, clearly pharmaceutical industries are in it for a profit, right? But I highly doubt they're just going to be like, you know what, we should create some new drugs just to give them to people. They have to go through FDA approval. You cannot just start pumping out medications. The FDA, in the trials for the FDA, to get an FDA clinical trial is not easy. For a while, I was associated with Ohio State Center for Psychedelic Drug Research and Education, where they are currently doing FDA-approved clinical trials on psilocybin and psychedelic-assisted therapy for military vets with PTSD. So my colleagues have told me this is what we have to do to get FDA approval to go through this. It is incredibly complex, and it takes months, sometimes even years, to get FDA approval. So again, I can appreciate people's concerns about medications, but again, to just go right to that, like it's big pharma doing all this stuff. It's like, we have checks and balances. We have things that are going on. And the general public isn't usually aware of that. So again, kind of going back to that point. If I could real quick, I would like to make another point that you had mentioned about the elitism of science or scientists. That, I think, is one of the key elements that rubs a lot of people the wrong way, of this kind of elitism. My counterclaim to that is like, yeah, like in general, sometimes scientists can be snobby. So can anybody else. But this idea is of elitism. There kind of has to be. Not everybody in the general public can devote the time, the energy, the effort, the cognitive resources to studying phenomena at such a deep level. And so when people say like, I'm not going to listen to the scientists because they're elitists, that seems like a really bad argument to go off of, because having that kind of elitism, whatever you want to call it, it's like, yeah, because they've spent way more time than you understanding these things. Yeah. And I think the way it's communicated, so I really appreciate science communicators who can do this really well and not belittle the general public or belittle people in general. That's the way we need to go as scientists, and that's the way that I try to go about it. But I think educating the public of this is how science works, and there's a reason there is some of that elitism. Again, you could say, okay, let's say I go to buy a car and I'm talking to a car salesman. The car salesman is going to have a level of elitism that he knows more about cars than I do, because he is the expert in some senses, right? And I am not. It's the same thing in science. The scientist is the expert. The same thing in government. The city council is supposed to be the expert in local policies. Same thing as being a teacher. The teacher is supposed to be an expert, right? So one of the things that's happened recently is the erosion of trust in experts. I want to make another counterpoint to what I just said, and I know I'm kind of rambling, but I do think that it is important to recognize I am not saying scientists are infallible. That, I think, is the confusion, elitism, thinking perfect, thinking their ideas are always right. No, science is a human activity. We get stuff wrong, right? We are people. We have our own biases. But when we look at how science functions as an institution, I don't know. The track record of science seems to be way better at helping people than Dianetics, for example. Listening to your doctor on taking medications, you're probably better off doing that than listening to, somebody just on Facebook saying you should do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
So I see these critiques and I do empathize for people when sometimes as scientists we can come off as egg-headed and those kind of things. But I also think it's important to clarify of like, yes, there is a level of elitism because we do know more about our subject than you do.
Right.
And that's okay. You should want the expert to know more than you do.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, there's a ton of examples that show there's a huge unmet need, and a huge thirst for honest to God experts who are good at explaining their field to the general public.
Yes.
And the difference is that they are also experts in the field. So whether it's a Neil deGrasse Tyson or a Brian Cox or someone else. And it's funny because sometimes they do come across as really, loving the smell of their own farts. But it's like, but look how famous some of these people become for even being willing to take their science and try to explain it in an easily understandable way.
Yeah, and honestly, when I heard you wanted to talk to me, when I heard Natalie wanted to talk to me, I look at I've always tried to be a science communicator. I've tried to be someone who, like, I'm not trying to shut down people or always tell them they're wrong. I mean, I'll tell them that their ideas are wrong or uninformed by science, but I think you hit the nail on the head. I really appreciate the science communicators. I think back to when I was a kid watching Bill Nye the Science Guy. I'm like, wow, right? Like, here are these really complex ideas, and Bill Nye is able to break them down to the level that an elementary school child can understand these ideas. And again, as an instructor, when I'm teaching intro psychology, I'm always saying to myself, Jordan, they don't know as much as you know. Jordan, they don't know as much as you know. Or when I'm talking to my clients and I'm explaining, I'm describing, hey, this is the evidence that I found to suggest that this disorder is present. And I think that this treatment would be really helpful for you. I have to communicate that in an effective way. I want to be effective. I want to help people. So I completely agree with what you're saying. And so I've tried to internalize that as, hey, how can I communicate the information and knowledge I know to other people so that it is helpful for them? And again, I can see how, scientists coming off as elitist and how that turns people off. 100%. Like, especially if you tell people they're stupid, that's not effective communication. That's not effective to learning. So there seems to be somewhat an increasing emphasis on communication among professionals for the general public. So there's the American Psychological Society, APS. One of their journals, their scientific journals, is specifically about communicating psychological science to the public, right? So like there are people that are trying to get better about this. And so again, one of my motivations, and I'm honored that you wanted to hear what I have to say, but I really take this to heart because I want people to understand science and psychological science specifically.
Yeah, that's awesome. About the unfalsifiability aspect of pseudoscience.
Yeah.
It's almost like L. Ron Hubbard didn't even try to hide some of this stuff at a certain point. So like there's a fundamental principle in Scientology. Scientology works 100% of the time when applied 100% standardly. And if it doesn't, you either did something wrong or the person is committing crimes that they haven't disclosed. And you're like, but hold on, that you immediately just invalidated the 100% of the time. You're like, first of all, that's unfalsifiable. But here's where it gets even more interesting. He doesn't say that in order for it to work, you have to apply it 100% standardly. So he's like, no. if it work, you don't have to apply it perfectly for it to work. But if it doesn't work, it's because you didn't do something perfectly.
Yeah. Yeah. And some people would, so that could be, you know, another characteristic of pseudoscience where basically it's that built-in escape hatch. It's what we call ad hoc reasoning, or ad hoc hypotheses. Oh, it works, but it doesn't work if you did this or this or this. So yeah, and those were some of the words that I found where I was like, wait a minute, no scientifically based treatment works 100% of the time. If a scientist, we don't talk like that. For example, when I have clients and I suggest, you know, a scientifically based treatment for their difficulties, let's say for depression, right? I'll say things like, you know, I think the unified protocol for transdiagnostic emotional disorders would probably be really helpful for you. It doesn't work 100% of the time. We don't know why, but you have a better chance of getting better with this treatment than no treatment at all, right? So even when you truly listen to scientists, and again, if they're being honest, and we should be talking this way. I talk in probabilities that you're better off to do this. So even when we hear L. Ron Hubbard using 100% of the time, no psychologist would say that, or I would hope no psychologist or person in the mental health field would say, yes, this treatment works 100% of the time, because it doesn't. And we know that. Again, when you do scientific studies, you know, with what are called like a randomized clinical trial, we get a group of people who agree to participate in the study, and then we randomly assign them to groups. So now a lot of times we use like random number generators to assign each participant a number, and then it sorts them into different groups. So let's say that we're trying to determine the effectiveness of Jordan's psychotherapy. I would do a clinical trial, and then I would randomly assign participants to my new psychotherapy and to some other condition, just in kind of basic terms. And then we would calculate what percentage of each group got better. So let's say we're looking at depression. We would want to see a decrease in depression scores. Even then, we would be like, oh, this Jordan's group, their depression scores, let's say, 80% of the group's depression scores decreased, whereas the control condition, only 60% decreased. And we could be like, okay, Jordan's is probably better. But even there, not 100% of people got better. So again, I like that you brought that up. And that was one of the big things to me when I was reading this proclamation. I was like, no, full stop. That's not how science works. We don't have that level of sophistication.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that you in your speech you pointed out is, you know, a symptom of pseudoscience is making a claim that there is one single cause for, well, really anything.
Yeah.
And, you know, in Dianetics, he very clearly says the reactive mind, as described by L. Ron Hubbard with engrams and facsimiles and secondaries and locks and all this stuff, is the sole source of all psychosomatic ills in human beings, and that only through the methods of Dianetics can you resolve these things. And I think he said some, I don't know, 80 to 90% of all physical ills are psychosomatic, or whatever claim he made in Dianetics.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, go ahead. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I was gonna say, yeah, that was the other interesting thing too. So actually, I was just getting stuff together for my lecture next week for my class, and we're going to be covering stress, health, and coping. And you know, for a long time, the general and a good percentage of the general public still believes this, but that stress causes ulcers, peptic ulcers. That's not true. We call it it could be psychosomatic related, meaning stress can exacerbate some of that. But we now know that the cause of peptic ulcers is it's H. pylori, I believe is what it's called. It's I believe a bacteria that is in the gut lining of people with peptic ulcers. So like again, he was making a lot of these claims in the 50s, but then continued to make these claims. But even that, I was like, that is just not true, that the reactive mind causes ulcers. It's just not true. Like that was one of the clearest as day in, I believe it was the 1970s or 1980s, the National Institute of Health came out and said, yes, H. pylori leads to these kind of things. Stress can make it worse, but this bacteria does. So you're right. Like talking in that way, I call it the silver bullet or the magic bullet, that there are these one causes of a difficulty is not true. And a lot of times I think it seems to be a conception just in people generally. We like to look for what is the single cause of my problems. And what I like to do with my clients when I'm educating them about, their diagnoses or whatever it is, and when I'm talking with my students, I try to help them see of like, no, there are multiple factors for a human behavior, right? Whether that's the way we think, feel, and these kind of things. It's never as simple as a single cause. And honestly, again, in psychological science, it's really difficult to isolate a single cause. We're not like physics, where physics is a little bit easier, right? Or in some biological medicine, sometimes you can isolate these single causes. It's just not so with human behavior. So again, I like that you bring that out. And that was another thing where I was just like, that's just not true. Like, especially with depression or these psychosomatic conditions and these kind of things. Again, stress, if you wanted to make this leap of reactive mind maybe being a thing and maybe being related to stress, I'm like, yeah, we know that there is a body of psychological science about psychosomatic illnesses. But again, it's not that simple. So I appreciate you picking that out. And I just wanted to debunk that to the city hall of like, this is dangerous.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
In I guess the field of critical thinking or logic or whatever, there is this one pitfall in logic or debate or argumentation, which is the appeal to authority. Yes. How do you recognize? How do you reconcile the problem with appeal to authority? How do you reconcile that with what I guess I'm just going to casually call the natural authority and elitism that sort of comes about when you have experts in a field that are a very small percentage of the population, and then you have everyone else?
Yeah. That is a great question. You have really good questions. These are fantastic. And honestly, again, as far as like communicating science and stuff, these are the questions people want to know and that we as scientists should answer. And so if we're thinking of it from what some people call an informal logical fallacy, because you have logical syllogisms and these kind of things. But you're right. Appeal to authority. How do I square someone's claim of, oh, Jordan, you're just appealing to authority by listening to the American Psychiatric Association? It would depend on how I said it and what I said. If I said, this is true solely because the American Psychiatric Association says it, that would probably be more appeal to authority. And again, there may not be, in that situation, it may not be bad to appeal to authority in that situation. Appeal to the experts. What's wrong with that? They are the experts by definition. Probabilistically, I'm better off listening to them and taking their advice than I am listening to someone who has no training in this. So I think what happens sometimes is it's called the fallacy, where people will say, well, we can't listen to you because you committed one fallacy in your argument. It's like, yeah, we make fallacies in our argument. What I say is, if that authority is a recognized scientific body of experts and they are truly experts, then I'm probably better off listening to them. For example, I have right here, there was an author, his name is Goldman, And he came up with 5 criteria of identifying or trusting a true expert. Number 1, Goldman says, examine the arguments between experts and rivals. So we would want to know, like, what is the expert claiming? What is the rival claiming? What is the American Psychological or Psychiatric Association claiming? And what is L. Ron Hubbard claiming? Right? So we would want to look at their arguments. We would want to look at the evidence of agreement by other experts. So maybe there's one or a few people in the American Psychiatric Association who do say Dianetics is science. Okay, what is the rest of the professional body saying? It's more likely that the larger professional body is correct than this small group of making these claims. Now, I could be wrong, but if the larger body of experts is saying this, it's like, okay, that's probably a thing. But you could also check, what does the American Psychological Association say? What does the American Association of Pediatrics say? Right? You could check other people in related fields and see if they're doing that. So Goldman says, what's the evidence of agreement between other fields to know if you're talking about an expert? Independent evidence that the expert is an expert. So if someone is like, oh yeah, I'm an expert in mental health, Aaron, you should say to me, Jordan, how are you an expert in mental health? And then I would say, well, I have a license to practice psychology by the state of Michigan. I have been teaching psychology, right? Like, I could give you the evidence that I am, I would say, somewhat of an expert in the mental health field. So you can go through and look at these criteria. So the appeal to authority, I think, should be on our radar. I'm not dismissing it. But there are clearly situations where you are better off saying, I don't know. Again, I'm not a biologist. I'm not a doctor. But if the American Academy of Pediatrics says, hey, your child should have this vaccine, I'm going to go with what the experts say. So again, this is a really good point. Be aware of who is claiming to be an expert, but find who the expert body actually is. And if you're a betting person, you're probably better off betting on the expert group than just someone making claims.
Interesting. I feel like I'm starting to think about it overall in a way that makes more sense to me. So the problem with appealing to authority isn't that you're able to recognize that some people simply are more informed and more expert in a particular area. The problem is if that's where your thinking stops, that because this person who is simply one of the many authorities on a subject said this, it is therefore unquestionably true and will always be unquestionably true.
And that, again, you're hitting the nail on the head too, because one of the things we can do when we check our thinking is what words are we using? And again, if we're using, what I call like the extreme words, the all or none and those kind of things. Again, I go back to scientists. We are wrong. We have been wrong, right? Like, we've been wrong a lot. But if you look at the track record of scientists versus just a lay person investigating the natural world, finding out things, you're probably better off going with a scientist, right? So if you full stop, either say you are just going to just listen, bow down to the authority, or you're not going to listen to the authority because they've been wrong before, I don't think that's the most reasonable position to be in. Again, we should critique scientists. I am a fan. The public should say, scientists, how do you know this? We as a public, we should be saying that all the time. We should really say it to everybody. How do you know this claim? What's your evidence and those kind of things? But I think there's also that problem of if you just go full stop, well, I'm going to believe this one person 100% of the time. Yeah, that's dogma. And I would be the first person to tell you, please don't believe me for everything that I say. Talk to someone else. Look up the other literature, right?
Right. Well, you see, that's interesting because when you say believe one person 100% of the time, you've just described Dianetics and Scientology and how they view L. Ron Hubbard. That is dogma. And I think one of the interesting things here is to recognize that if someone's appealing to an authority, it's almost instantly a misnomer, because one person who is an authority in an area is not representative of the opinion of all the other authorities in that space. You could have the 10 top experts in a field and they don't all agree on the thing. And that's the science. It's those guys all proving to each other, or trying to convince their highly informed peers of what the testing, the fact that they don't agree on things is actually how science progresses.
Yes.
Right.
100%. 100%. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head right there. We don't want everybody to agree. But here's the thing too, and where things get kind of confusing, right? Is I look at it kind of like the experts agree on the skeleton of the scientific body, if you will. And I'm gonna demonstrate it with a point from biology. I'm not a biologist. I'll be the first one to say that. But from my understanding, right? Okay, one of the most successful scientific theories ever devised, and that we have evidence for, is the theory of evolution, natural selection. Now, my understanding is there are debates within biology, in these other fields, about exactly how the mechanisms, how does evolution actually occur? So you have some people borrow on like the modern synthesis. Some people have argued, like I believe Massimo Pigliucci argues for like an extended modern synthesis that looks at these different mechanisms of how evolution of a species actually occurs. So you're right. Even within the field, it's like, okay, all the biologists agree evolution is a thing. Where they're quibbling is the finer details of it. The skeleton of the thing is formed. They're just trying to flesh it out a little bit more. And again, talk to a biologist more about this. But that's kind of how I look at it. And you're right. Like, not everybody's going to agree. And that is how the science is being done. We're doing studies. We're getting evidence. We're making arguments. And that's how we make this progression. So that's a great point.
Yeah. You know, I can think of, there's just one example that keeps coming to the forefront of my mind where it seems like an entire field got it so wrong for so many decades. And it's examples like this that breed distrust of authorities in general. And I'm going to get this example slightly wrong, but it has something to do with the American Heart Association and, you know, some things they've said about cholesterol and its link to heart disease, or whether it was, I don't know if they were talking about trans fats or cholesterol, but then, you know, 40, 50 years later, they just literally completely reverse their recommendations on this. And how do you explain something like that?
To me, because people use that as evidence of why we shouldn't trust experts' science, right? To me, that's evidence of why we should. Oh, they admitted they got it wrong. And here's the other thing too. It is the scientists who are critiquing themselves who advance science. It doesn't usually come from the outside. It wasn't someone in their own lab doing it was other scientists within that field. That's that self-correcting mechanism. Same thing for, like, you know, you look at psychology, right? Of like, now the field is starting to move more towards what we call transdiagnostic treatments, where before we were kind of looking at like, okay, we have this psychological treatment for this disorder, this psychological treatment for this disorder. But what we found over the decades as the research has progressed is that a lot of these disorders share commonalities, in that we could use one treatment that's transdiagnostic that targets those different processes more parsimoniously, more effectively. But it wasn't someone from outside psychology who figured that out. It was the scientists themselves. And I can give you the name, David Barlow. I believe he's at either Boston College or Boston University. He has done a lot of work on treatment of primarily anxiety and depressive disorders. And so, you know, he created a lot of the manuals for cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety and depressive disorders. And so that was like his big platform for decades. And then as he continued to research, he's like, wait a minute. These emotional disorders, specific phobias, generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, PTSD, OCD, major depressive disorder, they all have these psychological factors in common. Maybe we should try this treatment that targets all of those processes, maybe that'll be better. And so the field of even psychotherapy has expanded. So now some people are like, yeah, like let's try these treatments as maybe opposed to this other treatment. So we are inherently moving away. And that was through scientists. So yeah.
You know, I just had a thought.
Yeah.
Because I have this weird bias having come out of Scientology, where the idea that someone writes a book and all of a sudden they're the expert on something, I have such an allergy to thinking that someone is, or when I see someone being regarded as an expert just because they happen to be someone who put their ideas onto paper and bound it in a book. But what just occurred to me is that, okay, the guy that you just described, who's David
Barlow.
So what I started thinking as soon as you started talking about him is I started going, just because some guy starts seeing a bunch of patients, you know, clinically, and then starts writing down his ideas, I started to think, so all you're doing is describing the freaking patients that you're seeing. That doesn't actually make you an expert in anything. Yeah. And then my second thought was, well, it makes him more of an expert than someone who's not seeing patients. Yep. And then my third thought was, I think one of the problems that we run into, and I'll speak for myself, but I also want to kind of generalize it to society, is the guy who's writing his thoughts down in a paper or a book isn't necessarily the guy saying, I'm the expert. It's people who worship books who are like, oh my God, there's a book. This is everything. And this is true. Yeah. And this is, this is unquestionable. And it's like, wait, that's not necessarily what the guy who wrote the book was saying.
Yes.
It's just the most recent updated, expression of where the research stands at this point.
You bring up a lot of good points too that I want to point out too. Like this is fantastic. Is the difference between publishing a book and publishing a peer-reviewed scientific study. Books are not peer-reviewed. Anybody can publish a book, right? And going back to David Barlow's work, it's a group of scientists working together who are studying these groups. You know, we recruit participants, we give them the treatment, we're doing all this kind of stuff. But again, David Barlow and his colleagues have published, I've read them, peer-reviewed scientific articles. So yeah, you can go online and buy the treatment protocol from, you can buy it on Amazon of the unified protocol. But that evidence is based on the scientific evidence. So again, going back to your point of like, you're right. We should all be skeptical of books, right? Anybody can write a book. But then again, if someone said, Jordan, how do you know David Barlow is an expert, or what evidence can you bring forth to support that David Barlow's treatment is effective? I would say, well, here's his article with his colleagues from, I'm going to pull a date off some. I could literally send you all of these articles. I have them saved in my Microsoft OneDrive. But I could say, oh, this is a study from 2020 where David Barlow and his colleagues did a randomized clinical trial looking at the effectiveness of the unified protocol versus other treatments. So you're right. There is that difference between books, and books are great. A person, not necessarily an expert, could summarize the findings. And so it's like, that's great. But then we have this other avenue that this is kind of that elitism part, right? In that the peer-reviewed scientific articles, because they can be difficult to access due to paywalls and those kind of things, which a lot of scientists have problems with. But again, if the public wants access to peer-reviewed scientific journals, you can go to PubMed. I do it all the time. I have access to databases where I'll pull stuff from, but you can Google PubMed, go to the PubMed website, and you could find some of these articles are free, or you could email the researcher, right? There are ways to access these, but the peer-reviewed, the scientific articles are fundamentally different than a book. Right. The general public. Can I go on, continue on of like my experience as a, So I am a reviewer for the psychological journal called Current Psychology. So the journal has said that, Jordan, you're an expert in autism spectrum disorder. Will you please review these manuscripts to us to see, if this is a good study. And again, there are multiple experts that review these studies, and then it's ultimately up to the editor to decide whether they're published or not. So again, a gatekeeping mechanism. So a group of scientists will publish a manuscript. They'll email it to the publisher, who then emails it to me and says, Jordan, please look over this and provide us with your comments. And I've actually shown my students what this process looked like. And I showed them the last article I reviewed. I think I had 2 pages worth of critiques where I said, this is not to the scientific standard. I told the other scientists, you need to fix these things. And it was only after multiple rounds of revision that the article was ultimately accepted for publication. So again, it is experts who are critiquing this study to then say, yeah, like this looks good, or hey, how about this? And then it gets published. Now, granted, we can talk about problems. There are what are called degree mills, and there are some problems going on right now in science that we're trying to clean up. But again, it is inherently different than just picking up a book and reading it and being like, oh yeah, like this person's an expert, or oh, this person wrote this book, so this is true. That's not usually how it goes. Or like as far as science.
Yeah. No, it's funny. I guess when you were talking about David, what was it? David Bauer? David
Barlow. I think it's Barlow.
It's funny. I guess I instantly assumed that he was out here writing books on the subject, and I don't know if he has, but you're more concerned with his peer-reviewed published studies.
Yeah.
It's funny because as soon as someone writes a book, also now all of a sudden they've got something to sell. They've got a financial incentive. It's sort of part of their personality. They've got something to be defensive about. Yeah. And that's kind of a problem. Because, I mean, honestly, there's a bit of what's the phrase? Oh, he literally wrote the book on the subject. It's like, I got someone else who wrote a bunch of books on the subject. His name is L. Ron Hubbard.
Yeah, 100%. But again, too, this kind of goes back to the question, we could pose the question of, like, is this person who published this book, are they an expert? Right. David Barlow is an expert. It's like, okay, if someone had any questions, if David Barlow is an expert, Google David Barlow. You would find his university page where he lists most of his scientific publications. So again, you're right. It, like with books and these kind of things, it leads to that question of like, are you an expert? And the other kind of question that could come up to people's mind, or one thing that we should say to people, one of the signs that something may not be going correctly is when books are published by people and they solely list like their academic credentials. That can be a problem sometimes, because some people will earn, let's say, a doctoral degree in, I'm going to use this example, art history, and then they'll write a book potentially about like diet, but they'll put PhD at the end, and it's like, oh, this person's an expert. Well, no, like that would be questionable to me. It's like, okay, then again, we should ask the question, is this person an expert in dieting, exercise, and those kinds? Oh, they have a PhD in art history. I probably shouldn't be reading their book, right? So checking those academic credentials can be one way to help suss out if someone is an expert.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. Okay.
I know it kind of.
No, I was gonna talk about something that was very specific to my community, but I'm gonna bite my tongue on that one. Okay. Scientology's biggest example of how you cannot trust the mental field is, remember lobotomies? They all like lobotomies.
Yep.
That didn't work out very well for them. And if they can make that mistake, you can never trust them again.
Yeah. And honestly, I would say, I would look a Scientologist in their face. I say, you're 100% correct on the problems of lobotomies. I would also say that wasn't psychologists. That was like the medical doctors, right, who are doing those kind of things. But again,
it wasn't psychiatrists. I mean, I know psychiatrists are MDs.
It was psychiatrists were doing some of this. So yes, psychiatrists, not psychologists. Psychiatrists are medical doctors. Psychologists are not medical doctors. So I just wanted to make that distinction.
So, but to a Scientologist, that's even worse. It's like, so you're telling me the most expert of the experts made that mistake.
And then I would say to them, it was the experts, the most experts of experts, who realized they were wrong. You know, and you're right. Again, this is one thing I will say, okay? When people critique, and I was telling Natty this, I'm one of the biggest critiques of my own field. And that, again, is how we better the science, how we better ourselves. And again, when we look at the history of some of these medical interventions, it was only through the advent of using scientific thinking and reasoning and studies that we were able to overturn, oh, yeah, hey, we should not be giving people, you know, leucotomies and lobotomies. They are very harmful, right? But again, it wasn't Scientologists or anybody else who figured that that was a problem. It was other medical doctors who were like, okay, guys, we have to stop doing this.
It's funny. I mean, to be honest, even in Scientology, that the truth and the simplicity of what you're describing right now honestly never occurred to me in Scientology. You're like, yeah, it wasn't the Scientologists that made them realize it was bad. It was members of their own field. Now, but as a Scientologist, I'd go, took him kind of a long time, didn't it?
Well, and again, right? Like, and then I would say, I mean, I would argue, okay, what do we call long? And yes, but I would also say, this is kind of the pro and the con of science. Right. Science moves slowly. It's not a knee-jerk reaction thing, because we have to build evidence and we have to build a case and we have to use logic. And this takes time. And so, yeah, it looks like, oh, wow, like, you know, look how long it took them to do this thing. But it's like, okay, well, they thought they had a reason to do this. And I'm not saying that they were right. But again, it takes time, and that's unfortunately, the kind of part of science that I think there's a degree that we have to somewhat be willing to accept. And with time comes the ability to continue to critique and be like, okay, is this really a problem? Is this really a thing? Right? So again, I empathize with people's critiques of the mental health field. It's 100% a thing, and we should always be critiquing it within the field and from without.
Right.
That I have no problem with. But again, I go back to, it wasn't the Scientologists or anybody else. It was other scientists who were like, hey guys, you messed up.
I really like that explanation. For some reason, it hadn't quite occurred to me before. I'm reminded of another thing that I feel like I hear all the time, which is, whichever scientist was the first one, and I know it's a very famous name, but I'm just going to, whether it was Da Vinci or someone else, who first said, hey, you know, everything isn't revolving around the earth. It looks like the earth is revolving around the sun. Who was it?
Well, Galileo.
Okay, let's say it was Galileo.
Yep.
Did they kill him for that?
Galileo was not killed.
Okay.
He was put on house arrest, but you're thinking of, they burned him at the stake.
But whoever it is we're thinking of, and whatever it was he was burned for, I think the response would be, yeah, but it wasn't the other scientists who burned him.
Yeah.
And it was the other scientists that eventually confirmed he was correct.
Yes, exactly. 100%. It's like, we're not out here trying to like get people fired or, you know, like kill people.
Yeah,
you're right. It's like,
it was like the king who burned him or something, you know?
Yes.
Or the Pope. It was either the king, it was either the head of the state or the head of the church that burned him. It wasn't his fellow scientists.
That's gonna drive me nuts. Because I think but you're right. Again, the critiques.
I'm gonna ask AI something. This question: which scientist was killed for his theory that ended up being correct? Okay, let's see. Let's see what it says. Giordano Bruno.
Bruno. Yes. Okay. Yep.
He was executed by the Roman Inquisition in 1600. He proposed a heliocentric view of the universe, building on Copernicus's ideas, and suggested that the stars were distant suns with their own planets. While his ideas weren't fully proven in his lifetime, Later observations, likely by Galileo and Kepler, confirmed heliocentrism.
Yep.
Yeah, he was tried for heresy, and after refusing to recant, he was burned at the stake.
Yep. Yeah. So okay. Yeah, I was right. Like Galileo was in there. Yeah. So Bruno was burned. Yeah, the church was not super thrilled about, right, because the heliocentric being, right, like the sun, the center, right, of our universe, because the church, the Roman Catholic Church was like, no, the earth, human beings are. And so yeah, that caused a stink, and they burned him.
Yeah. But it is interesting, now that I'm thinking about this, that every time I have heard this story told, it is told to sort of bolster the idea that scientists who are ahead of their time are never really believed. And yet even this example is bad because it wasn't his fellow scientists that were refusing to entertain and try to falsify his novel ideas.
Yeah, it is kind of remarkable that way. And it's like, yeah, like maybe, you know, again, in science, you know, I think there have been some cases where like the ideas weren't immediately adopted, right? Yeah. But it's like, again, over time, and then people are like, oh, like in the scientific community, they're like, no, they were right. They were okay. Like we were wrong. But again, this gets back to science as a mechanism, as an institution, is not knee-jerk reaction. Science is both a process and a body of knowledge. And so like you need to gather more data to kind of overturn the already accepted body of knowledge. And that takes time. And so I can understand why people get frustrated that way and how some of these things happen. But again, in a way, it's maybe a good thing, because then again, it's not as reactionary, right? As if people were doing those things at the drop of a hat.
Right. It is also interesting to consider that in any field of science, you are going to have professional members of that field who are massive outliers in even what they believe. And so, you know, in Scientology, they managed to find a psychiatrist named Thomas Saz to sort of be the standard bearer for their citizens, their anti-psychiatry front group, CCHR, Citizens Commission on Human Rights. And I can tell you, as a good little Scientology soldier, the fact that there was a psychiatrist, just one, a single psychiatrist willing to stand with Scientology and go, psychiatry is evil. I was like, oh, damn, that must be true then, because one psychiatrist is saying it.
Yep. And again, this goes back to too of like when you think about probabilities and these kind of things. And I do believe Thomas Say's work was probably, I think it was a little bit more complex than that, but you're right. He's usually considered one of the anti-psychiatrists, right?
But you know what's funny is as a former Scientologist, I actually have no idea what any piece of Thomas's work was. All I knew was psychiatrist, and he agrees with Scientology, and my thinking ended right there.
Yep. And again, you know, that same line of thinking, when we can trot out, you know, when a group can trot out one scientist, the same thing happens for climate change, right? Like, you know, there are people who deny the existence of anthropogenic climate change because they can trot out one or a few scientists that are like, yeah, see, they don't agree with the establishment. But then the question should become, who are you going to put your money on? Are you going to go with the scientists who study weather, earth phenomena, these kind of things? Or are you going to go with these one or two people over here? You know, and I think that it's difficult to see that. So when I hear you saying like people say, it's difficult to kind of reason beyond that, because I mean, it's a strong example. Yeah, there it is. I got my proof. But then again, it's a form of confirmation bias, right? Confirmation bias, the tendency to seek things that we already agree with, or people who agree with us, and not think about people who disagree with us or ideas that disagree with us. So Scientology is like, yep, we'll take Thomas Sayers, we'll put him out, and, you know, see, he's anti-psychiatry, so therefore he's right. You know, and this happens with a lot of these fringe ideals, is that you'll find one scientist and then use them. But it is also interesting too, if you think about it, because I always think about it's paradoxical, right? So in Scientology, you don't agree with psychiatrists, so you have this former psychiatrist who is now you're using, right? Like there's a paradox to that. It's like, how do you square that?
You agree with the so-called expert only when he agrees with you.
Yes, confirmation bias. Yes, it's very strong in human beings. And some people argue, science. One of my intellectual heroes, Scott Lilienfeld, he was a psychologist. He unfortunately passed away. It was like 4 years ago now, but he's one of my intellectual heroes. And he claims, he's like, science is about protecting us from confirmation bias, because as human beings, we're almost probably predisposed to searching for information that we agree with and stopping there and discounting stuff that doesn't agree or line up with our views. And Lilienfeld's like, no, like the good thing about science is inherently about proving ourselves wrong. If you read some of Popper's stuff or some of the other philosophers of science, they say that is actually what science should be, is that we should come up with a study, have a hypothesis, and we're actively trying to refute ourselves. We're actively trying to shoot our hypotheses down, to disconfirm our hypotheses. There's a large group of people that say that that's how science should operate.
Right. One of the basic, most simplistic explanations in Scientology for why therapy or counseling of any type is bad and Scientology auditing is good is this explanation. In Scientology, they call it evaluation. And L. Ron Hubbard defined that word as telling a person what is wrong with them, telling a person what to think about their own mind, or as he would call it, their own case. And so L. Ron Hubbard says in therapy, the therapist tells you what is wrong with you. In Scientology, you are encouraged to look inside and find out for yourself what is the cause of your problems. And I'm curious to get, but I've only had one therapy session, and it was more of a marriage-based therapy session. And so I don't have a lot of experience with therapy.
Yeah.
I found the one session I had to be helpful. It was just too expensive to want to keep doing it.
Fair.
What is your thoughts? First of all, it's an incredibly oversimplistic explanation of therapy. And it also dawned on me that in Scientology, in the actual auditing session, the auditor is not telling the pre-clear what is wrong with them, but they don't have to, because all of L. Ron Hubbard's books and lectures are telling you what's wrong with you. And then you go into the auditing session to comply with basically what L. Ron Hubbard said. That dawned on me a couple months ago. That was like, oh my God, L. Ron Hubbard's evaluating for all Scientologists. He's just not doing it in the auditing session.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the truth or falsity of whether a therapy session is the therapist telling the patient what is wrong with them?
Yeah, this is another great question. So when we peel back the layers of this, first of all, I operate from what the general psychological science says in some aspects, that as human beings, we are not fully aware of how our minds function, right? So there is this inherent problem of like us trying to identify our own problems. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. We can clearly reflect on like, yeah, this is a problem. This is kind of a thing. But sometimes when people say, just reflect and you'll find your own problems, it's like, that seems kind of delusional, because human beings, we're bad at reasoning. Again, confirmation bias. So I would say that that's a problem. Just sitting there trying to identify your own problems isn't always helpful. Again, we're aware of some of them. But this kind of also somewhat goes back to the expert, right? Now, again, in psychotherapy, a client clearly has greater access to their thoughts and feelings than I have access to. So I'm operating on some verbal reports or looking at their facial expressions and those kind of things. But sometimes, as a clinician, as an expert, I am going to tell you, hey, or I try not, when I'm doing therapy, I try not to tell people what their problems are. I try to ask them questions to elicit their response and see their understanding. So I think if you're doing it in the most helpful way, you're trying to instill some insight. I'll say things like, hey, you told me this and you told me this. I'm wondering if that might have some effect on some of your difficulties. Like what do you make of that? So we're reflecting back to them. But then there are other times where, again, I specialize in diagnostics. So people are coming to me for me to tell them what their problems are, right? And so again, ADHD, I specialize in neurodevelopmental disorders, ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, that kind of class of disorders. And, if a person is going to determine that they have a disorder, that would automatically imply that they're an expert in that disorder. But people are not, hence why they go to a therapist. So sometimes, I guess kind of what I'm saying to flesh this out a little bit more is like with ADHD, some people have inklings and that's why they come to me to see like kind of what's going on. But what I can then do, because I have an understanding of the literature, is I can kind of help the person understand how some of their difficulties may be interconnected. For example, those with ADHD are less likely to complete college. They tend to enter college and then drop out. And so let's say that I have a client that is coming in, they happen to have ADHD and they've tried to enter college numerous times and have been unsuccessful. I could then say to them, hey, I think one of your difficulties with completing school is probably related to your inattentive symptoms of ADHD, difficulty with organization, time management, planning. That's probably related to this. So in a sense, I am telling them what their difficulty is due to. But again, it's based on the scientific evidence. So yeah. It can get kind of murky, I guess is what you're.
But it's also interesting that L. Ron Hubbard is actually creating a bit of a straw man argument that if you're giving someone some insight into their condition, that's bad.
Yeah.
And what happens in a Scientology auditing session, that's good. Well, that's just a false construct L. Ron Hubbard just created.
Yeah.
And here's where it dawned on me. Here's how it dawned on me. You don't know my whole history in Scientology, but let's just say I spent a whole lot of years studying Scientology full time as a Scientology staff member and a Sea Org member.
Yep.
There's many times where remember, I started this as a child, so it's not like I had anything to compare it to.
Yeah.
Many times where I'm listening to an LRH lecture and I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, that's so true. Or, oh my God, yes, I can see that. Or, oh my God, that's so helpful. Or, oh, like you're having some sort of a breakthrough, right?
Yeah.
So I know what that feels like.
Yep.
Okay. I was listening recently to, I've got to open this app. Someone's trying to call me. Okay. I was listening recently to, there's an amazing guy. I'm going to call him a therapist, but forgive me if that's wrong. His name is Tim Fletcher. He is an expert in complex PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
And he has done some amazing videos and interviews on this subject with people who suffer from complex PTSD. Mm-hmm. And he did an amazing podcast with Theo Vaughn. And he recently did a series of 4 with Jenna Miscavige. And while I'm listening, and these podcasts are essentially therapy sessions. Okay. He's essentially being a therapist to Theo Vaughn. He was essentially being a therapist to Jenna.
Okay.
As I'm listening, so Jenna, for example, would say something she suffers with or experiences, and then Tim would be like, can I comment? Can I say something about that? And then he would share information based on his expertise in working with hundreds, if not thousands of people who suffer from complex PTSD. And he's not trying to tell Theo exactly what's wrong with him. Yep. He's not trying to tell Jenna exactly what's wrong with her. He's trying to share with them knowledge and insight gained from, he's like, people who suffer from this, very common, will do this. And very often this will trigger them. And very often this. And I'm sitting here going, oh my God, that's so true. Or, oh my God, I can connect with that. Or, oh my God, that's amazing. And all of a sudden it dawned on me that what Tim was doing here is what a Scientologist would call evaluation. Mm-hmm. And yet it's exactly what L. Ron Hubbard does in his lectures. And I instantly was like, L. Ron Hubbard does the things he says therapists do that makes therapy bad.
Yeah.
But L. Ron Hubbard does the same thing, but he just does it in a lecture instead of an auditing session. And I realized the whole thing, everything came crumbling down once I realized that I was experiencing the same thing listening to Tim Fletcher as I used to sometimes listening to L. Ron Hubbard.
Yeah.
But then he created a false construct. If you do it in a session, it's bad. If you do it in a lecture, it's good.
Yep. Yeah, he no, and it sounds like you had like a really insightful, that was a powerful experience for you. And again, going back to, I'm not familiar with Tim Fletcher, but again, kind of like how I was saying, like if I'm providing some, some reflection to a client, if you will, or giving some of this feedback, we call it psychoeducation. In anybody who goes to therapy, counseling, whatever you call it, they have the right and they should be educated about their difficulty. And again, in the example you're saying that Tim used, that's the kind of language that I use. And I'll say things, this may not be true for you, but people with difficulties like yours tend to do this. And so we're using probabilistic language, right? Tendency, when we're kind of providing some of that education and those kind of things. And it is really interesting to hear you say of like, L. Ron Hubbard was kind of doing that, but he clearly wanted to make his own thing and separated it from psychology or clinical practice. But to me, psychoeducation, that is an inherent part of scientifically based mental health treatment. Any client should, we should be able to inform them. Again, going back to, ADHD, right? It's like, okay, people with ADHD, there's a correlation between having the diagnosis of ADHD and an increase in driving accidents. People with ADHD tend to have more driving accidents or tend to have more speeding tickets or tend to get divorced more than people without ADHD. Those are tendencies, they're correlates, right? But we can reflect that to people, right? I've had clients ask me of like, what are some of the outcomes of this disorder? And I said, well, in general, we know X, Y, and Z, right? So I appreciate one that you're able to make that distinction between L. Ron Hubbard and Tim, and also demonstrating that point. I just want to reiterate, mental health clinicians should be providing psychoeducation, not only about the diagnosis, but also about the treatment, because mental health treatment should be collaborative, right? So with my clients, what I say to them is, the scientific evidence suggests that this treatment is probably going to be most helpful for you. What do you think about that? This treatment includes X, Y, and Z, or these kind of things. And if the client is not for that type of therapy, then I'll be like, okay, well, we could try this type of therapy, right? It is inherently about trying to create an equal relationship, though there are some power differentials of like an expert, right? But it should be collaborative and it should provide psychoeducation. I'm hammering this point because I think it is an inherent part of clinical work that may sometimes not always get practiced like it should. And so I urge whenever I talk to my friends or any other people that talk to me, I was in counseling or this, I'm like, well, if they're talking about whatever, I'll be like, did you ask the clinician like what you were diagnosed with? Did you ask the clinician? I'm not trying to say like put all the onus on the client, right? Because this is something that clinicians should just inherently do. But I am also saying that if you are seeking good mental health treatment, that mental health provider should be able to answer your questions or at least say, I don't know, so this is a really important point. Thanks for bringing that up.
I mean, and the difference between most of the advice or insight or expertise that L. Ron Hubbard is claiming, he's obviously never citing studies. He's only cites studies to insult them. He's normally talking about stuff from past lives and just stating things that are totally facts and saying if, a pre-clear, when they do this, they'll do this, they'll do this. Anyone can eventually give advice just from their own life experience that seems to resonate with people. So L. Ron Hubbard would claim expertise, but it was that dawning on me that he was evaluating for all Scientologists all the time.
Yeah, that's an interesting insight about of how how that worked. I want to, if I can, real quick, I want to comment on what you just said to kind of bringing us back to kind of expertise, right? So if someone is evaluating the claims of L. Ron Hubbard, so when I'm looking at this book, Dianetics, and these kind of things, and again, going back to what are the characteristics of the person writing this book, and it's like, oh, L. Ron Hubbard has no credentials in the mental health field. Why am I going to listen to what this guy is saying? Right? So I think like that can give, obviously, if you're not being indoctrinated in it, but I'm just for people who are listening or just in general, like what were L. Ron Hubbard's credentials to discuss these things? Oh, he was a science fiction writer. Great. That's really cool. Like, awesome. I love Star Wars. But I'm not going to listen to if George Lucas publishes a book on mental health. I'm probably not going to read it, right? So I just wanted to make that comment.
It's true, and also he would make claims that were provably false. He would call himself a nuclear scientist because he attended one class in nuclear science at George Washington University that he failed.
I'm sorry. Like that is. It's interesting, right? He was trying to make himself an expert, but telling people not to trust experts. Again, that paradox. And then calling himself a nuclear scientist by attending one class. Like that's pretty remarkable. Wow.
Yes.
All right.
And you've heard the story of why Scientologists are not put off by the fact that he was a fantasy fiction author, right? Have you heard the story?
Well, Natalie and I were kind of talking about, I don't think I know the full story, but I did ask Natalie, I said, when was it that you discovered L. Ron Hubbard was a science fiction writer? To me, it's like, oh, if I know this guy's a science fiction writer, I'm probably not going to listen to him about mental health. And she's like, no, like that is inherently talked about in Scientology. It was never a bad thing. So I'm curious, tell me this story.
They believe, because L. Ron Hubbard claimed, that he is the reincarnation of Buddha, and that he was born with full and total recall of his last 76 trillion years and all of his lifetimes on all the planets and different solar systems and galaxies and even universes. And the reason he could prolifically churn out so much fantasy material and even his Westerns, he was just writing from his memories. He didn't have to think up the plot lines or anything. He was just writing from his memories. He didn't write fiction. He wrote real stories, but they're from his past lives.
Wow. Again, that is a remarkable claim. And so again, this kind of goes to one of the thinking principles and like kind of things that I would want, like that my students and I talk about, or that I try to talk about is, okay, first of all, we have an extraordinary claim requiring extraordinary evidence. That's a principle of scientific thinking. It's paraphrased from Carl Sagan, the astrophysicist. Some people refer to it as the Sagan standard. That line of thinking of extraordinary claims requires extraordinary evidence actually kind of goes back to, I believe it was David Hume, called Hume's Fork. We should proportion our beliefs to the amount of evidence that we have. Regardless, one of the things that I want to add, like I would like to ask L. Ron Hubbard or someone claiming this, I'd be like, what evidence do you have that he lived these past lives? Like evidence, not just, oh, because he said so. Again, right? That would be ad hoc reasoning or whatnot, circular reasoning. Like what evidence? You need extraordinary evidence to say like, oh my God, you lived that long? Like that's amazing. Show me. How did you do it?
Right. Even within Scientology, or even within what Scientologists believe, there's an obvious contradiction in the claim that he had full and total recall of his past lives. If he did, he would have popped out of the womb expressing evidence of all that knowledge. And yet, in his time in the armed services, which is a complete debacle, he was literally asking at one point for psychiatric help. He was actually asking for psychiatric help. He did not develop Dianetics until later in his life. And it's like, where was your full and total recall? Like by the time you were 15, 16 years old, you should have been churning out some of the most enlightened and insightful written works mankind has ever known.
Yeah.
Instead, you were committing petty crime, Yeah.
Yeah.
You were getting into you were shelling in the military. He accidentally shelled a Mexican island. He chased around a submarine that turned out to be a magnetic rock deposit. There's no evidence of any extra special memories or abilities whatsoever until he started making such claims as he started developing Dianetics in the I guess the late 40s.
And that, I mean, you're demonstrating right here critical thinking skills, right? Like, wait a minute. Okay, so if you have these extraordinary, why didn't they start sooner? Like you said, why did at 5 years old, why weren't you writing these stories down, right? Like, what was it that after that? And then again, not to necessarily attack his character, which could be, people like, oh, that's an ad hominem fallacy, but to talk about like, I find it interesting that he had concerns about like psychiatric concerns, like, hey, something's not quite right. Like, I think I need some help. And then again, you look at like clearly what he wrote and the things that he did were clearly not typical. And it's like, okay, yeah, there was probably something there that was atypical. I'll just say that.
That's right. Actually, even as you're just speaking, it's occurring. Even more contradictions are coming to me. One of the biggest things that separated Dianetics from Scientology was when he wrote Dianetics, it had nothing to do with past lives. It had nothing to do with any spiritual entity. There was no there was no thetan, there was no soul. It was intended to be like a poor man's psychotherapy. He said these incidents of pain and unconsciousness that he called engrams, that the earliest recorded engrams you could possibly have were in the womb, were prenatal. And that those engrams were the source of all further, the basis of what held in place psychosomatic illnesses. If he already had full and total recall of all of his past lives, he would have already been talking about past lives in Dianetics. Like, it's one of the things that he's like, well, once the boys in the Dianetics Research Foundation they started encountering these past life memories. It's like, how come you weren't the one who encountered the past life memories well before you wrote Dianetics?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, that's the thing about being in a cult. Don't think about it too deeply. You might realize you're in a cult.
Yeah. Well, and I was doing some digging in the literature of like what some of the things we know about the psychological factors that maintain people in these cults. Some scientists are now calling them GPAs, groups of something. So they're trying to kind of change the term, but they basically mean cult, right? But there are these social psychological factors that are maintaining people into these belief systems. And you're right, one of them is obedience and do not question the leader, right? Do not question the teaching, because if people think, they're going to start raising questions, and then you look at other great works, like 1984 and these kind of things of questioning the leader and how that's a bad thing, right? One of the things that keeps people stuck in these cults is the leader saying, don't think too hard, which to me is scary, because especially in a participatory democracy like the United States, it is inherently predicated on, it's a participative democracy, participatory. We are supposed to think and then contribute to the larger well-being. So if people aren't thinking, that is inherently a problem. But if you tell people not to think and just believe, you can keep them isolated and maintaining the lie, if you will, or the delusion, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. The best way to keep someone in a cult is to convince them that they're not in a cult. And one of the biggest items of cognitive dissonance in Scientology, and I remember struggling this when I was a young Scientology soldier, of going, oh, one day it dawned on me, oh my God, we have to say that everything this guy says is true. And if anyone contradicts what he says is true. I was like, I don't know how I would explain this to someone who asked me why we treat L. Ron Hubbard that way. Now, realize I wasn't troubled by the fact that we treated L. Ron Hubbard that way. I was troubled by the fact that I didn't know how I would explain it to someone if they asked me why. Okay?
I'm curious. because you mentioned cognitive dissonance. This is great, right? Cognitive dissonance is you have two opposing thoughts. So you either change your behavior, your thoughts to align them to decrease anxiety. I'm curious, Aaron, what was the thought that you used to kind of rationalize or to decrease the anxiety of that situation?
Once I found out that L. Ron Hubbard claimed to be the reincarnated Buddha, I went, oh, that explains it. Everybody loves Buddha. Okay. We can explain it. The guy was Buddha. You can't argue with Buddha. Everybody loves Buddha.
Interesting. And again, isn't this interesting how the human mind works? Again, based on what we know of the psychological science, right? And so that thinking is not surprising. And if we can kind of get tangential for a second, I want to come. Natalie and I were talking quite a bit about this, and I think that this is an important. I think sometimes, unfortunately, we can view people that are in these cults as like, oh my God, like it's your fault. You're brainwashed. How did you not know? A lot of these processes that keep people in these cults is just due to the general evolutionary cognitive machinery that we have now. Our minds are probably predisposed to seeking patterns. Our minds as human beings, we are probably predisposed to find meaning, one of the correlates of why people enter cults. So when I look at people who have these irrational beliefs, I think when we start to look at what are the factors maintaining them in these places, to me, it fosters more empathy, and to be like, okay, if we understand the mechanisms that are keeping the people maintained, then we can target those mechanisms to help them get out. And I think too, as like a public, to then view, like the literature suggests most people in cults, I'm going to use this term loosely, are psychologically healthy. Now there is some other evidence that mental health concerns increase after leaving the cult, in all these various reasons. But I think that when we look at the maintaining factors can increase more empathy. And I want to mention another cognitive bias of people. It's called the fundamental attribution error. And this is where we view somebody's problems or difficulties as their fault. But when we reflect on our own experience, we look at all the situational variables that led to a thing, right? So for example, let's say you go out to dinner and you see a customer at a restaurant being rude to a waitress or waiter. And you think to yourself, oh, like I would never do that. That person's an a-hole. You attribute their characteristics to the person's character. But then you reflect on yourself and you say, oh, well, maybe I've been upset before, but that's because I was having a bad day. Where we kind of give ourselves a little bit more grace. We look at those kind of factors that influence that. I think the same thing, we need to be aware of the fundamental attribution error when we look at people who are in these cults. Instead of just saying, oh yeah, you're a dumb dummy and like you just wouldn't do this thing. It's like, no, these are people who, some of them, like Natalie, she was brought up in it. She kind of didn't really have a choice, right? And so I think sometimes what I'm trying to be, I think, more communicative about when I have conversations with people is like, we need to think about people who are in cults as being misled, and there are these psychological factors that are maintaining them. And it's not just that they're ignorant or that they're stupid or any of these things. So I just felt like bringing that up. Because I've been doing a deep dive into Scientology now and like all these other things. But that's something that's really come up for me of like when I think about it. Now, this does not mean I'm going to excuse their behavior or I'm going to be like, oh yeah, say whatever you want. I'm still going to be in opposition to pseudoscientific claims. But there is that part of me now where it's like, I think compassion is probably the better way to go than anger.
Yeah. Yeah. I like what you said about kind of the cognitive machinery that we've kind of evolved with is largely responsible for a lot of, how we end up, what we end up believing, how we end up behaving, the path that we end up sticking to. Because, again, I was 4 years old when my mom got deeply involved in Scientology. I was 12 years old when I was taken out of school to start working for Scientology full time.
Okay.
because of my experience, being able to look back with hindsight and see how, despite the fact that I consider myself to be a reasonably intelligent guy, I consider myself to, be able to think pretty well. Scientology was my blind spot. Now, yes, it's because I was a child, but because I see that, being as a child, being put into a situation where your choices are really, children are very malleable. They can adapt, they can conform. And, I was in a situation where I was like, I don't feel like I have a choice but to do this. So I might as well really do it well.
Yeah.
And even though I was able to in Scientology differentiate between the things I believed and the things I didn't believe, I continued on this path that I didn't genuinely want to be on for a long time, because it just didn't occur to me that I couldn't be on that path anymore. And because I can see that that was my experience, when I see anyone else who is still very much believing and holding on to really anything that just happens to be the exact thing they were steeped in as children, I kind of go, you don't really believe that. You just don't know any better.
Yeah. I mean, and that can foster that empathy, right? But you bring up a really good point, though, too, of like talking about, again, the social pressures, the social psychological pressures, factors that are probably influencing these beliefs. We know this. Same thing with like political attitudes and religious beliefs. It's interesting. People that grow up in a certain politically affiliated household tend to have those beliefs as adults. People with certain religious beliefs in childhood, they grow up, right? And so we're talking about these pressures that are influencing what people believe. And so it's like, oh, yeah, okay. Well, if you have your mom and dad, or your caregivers or people you really value and love, and they're telling you these things, of course you're going to believe them. Right? In especially the way that Scientology appears to work, they exert such a great pressure on cutting off any type of critical thinking, outside associations. They provide an incubator, it appears to me, of constantly bombarding you with those messages. It's like, okay, yeah, you were, for lack of a better term, brainwashed and like went into these things. So I appreciate that you had that perspective. And sounds like you've had a really unique experience as well.
Yeah. Yes. And also, since I understand how impossible it is to talk a Scientologist out of their belief system, I also see that reflected in other people who have deeply held religious beliefs.
Yes.
And it's interesting, right? Because there's so many people in the political sphere, and I won't get partisan here, but there's so many people in the political sphere whose political beliefs are basically rooted solely in their religious beliefs.
Yeah.
And I'm willing to take someone's thoughts seriously and their arguments seriously until I realize, oh, you see, I like engaging in discourse with people who could at least theoretically be talked into a different opinion based on logic. But once I find out that your opinions are rooted in something nobody could ever talk you out of, I can't take your opinion seriously anymore. So like, I can think of some political pundits who, they seem smart. They seem to be able to talk through their positions well, but you go, oh, but all your political opinions are based on your religious beliefs. Okay. I can't really take you seriously anymore.
Yeah.
Because you will fight for those beliefs to the death. Nobody could rationalize you out of them.
Yep. And Natalie and I actually talked about this as well. And I think this is a very important point to understand as well, is when we talk about values that have a cognitive and an emotional component, we can't argue people out of their values, right? And like you said, with a religious belief and even kind of some of the political beliefs and these kind of things. And if the person is saying there is nothing you can do to convince me otherwise, then for me, the conversation just stops. Right. Because it's like, oh, okay, well, there is no evidence that could disprove or falsify your belief. So then you're right. It's probably not worth it to have this conversation. To a degree, we can quibble about that.
Well, and it's funny because I would also, like, if someone said that to me, I'd be like, oh, geez, I didn't think I was trying to convince you of anything, but I thought we were sharing ideas, and I realized we're not. You're just defending a position.
Exactly. And I think one, realizing this kind of takes some thinking and some work, but when we have conversations with anybody, especially these value-laden discussions that are centered around politics, right, and religious beliefs and these kind of things that are value-laden, being aware, trying to think to yourself, like, okay, are we talking about facts or are we talking about opinions, right? And if, depending on where this conversation is going or what are these kind of things are being said, I think when it comes to being a debater or arguing in just the general sense of having conversations with people, being able to kind of really put arguments in those two baskets can really help. Because you're right. You know, I have my own beliefs as far as religion and politics go and stuff like that. Actually, I try to pride myself. I like having these conversations. So a decent portion of my friends and a lot of my family have differing socio-political and religious beliefs than I do. However, there's a handful we talk about it all the time, but we can have this conversation. We're not trying to convince each other otherwise. You know, it's just kind of an exchange of ideas. And by recognizing like where we're coming from and by just trying to have a conversation and refraining from that adversarial part, you can learn a lot from people. Oh, he believes this probably because of this. This is how he sees the world. Okay, you know, that's fair. But if they're wrong about a point, then then I could critique that. I said, well, that's empirically false, you know, based on X, Y, and Z. So I just like to think about that when it comes to these kind of things, when it comes to talking to Scientologists. You know, it's like if someone is drawn to this cult because they're looking for a meaning, you know, I would say to them, well, there's other ways you could find meaning, right? But these are sticky and tough conversations. And when we're having these conversations with people to prevent our own frustrations and to have informative conversations, I think we should try and figure out where the conversation is going. Is it a values-laden conversation? Is it an opinion-based? Or are we talking about facts and the empirical world?
Yeah. I'll tell you, every now and then, depending on the subject that's the specific aspect of Scientology that's being discussed, you'll hear statements like Scientology isn't nearly as destructive as religions and much more other religions. And but here's one aspect of a huge difference. You can find videos of Christians openly debating and defending and explaining their beliefs to people that hate Christianity or whatever. You'll find those all day long.
Yeah.
You'll never find that with a Scientologist. They're not allowed to. And that says just about everything that you need to know.
Yeah. And going back to that, like again, you know, I argue that in a society, right? So this is clearly kind of more values laden, but we could see some empirical evidence about it. Like, we need open dialogue. And again, going back to, you know, my grandma called me today and she was like, you know, I'm really proud that you participated in local government, you know, that you went and you did that. We have the choice, the right, the freedom. And so to me, I was like, well, I have this freedom. And also in political bodies, it is incumbent on us. I think a lot of people forget that. Like, the reason things are kind of bad or good is because of people choosing to make actions, right? Like, it is up to us. So I was like, well, I could go speak at this thing and participate in this open dialogue. Okay, the Scientologist is going to be there. That's fine. I don't even have to talk to him. I didn't talk to him. But I have the choice and the right to have this engagement with the city council. And so I think that when we have a lot of these conversations, a lot of these ideals and stuff, it is the freedom to have these conversations that make something scientific or, you know, helpful, versus going back to like what you said, like in Scientology, nope, can't have that conversation, right? I think that's pretty indicative of cult pseudoscientific behavior versus kind of more democratic ideals and scientific ideals.
Absolutely. I got to tell you, nothing would be more entertaining than a Scientologist willing to come on with me and agreeing to be polite and civil and respectful and actually, you know, debate the parts of Scientology. Like, that would be amazing.
Yeah.
It would be a lot of fun.
100%.
And there should be no reason that a Scientologist couldn't do it. They'll fall back on the thing of, you're a suppressive person, I'm not allowed to be connected with you. It's like, we're not connected. We don't have to be friends. We can literally just interact on the video, never talk again. That doesn't make us connected. You know, if anything, you should want to confront and shatter my suppression. You know, the course in Scientology where they talk about suppressive persons and everything, it's called How to Confront and Shatter Suppression. You want to talk about cognitive dissonance? Scientologists aren't even allowed to interact with suppressive people.
Wow. Well, we're going to tell you how to do the thing, but guess what? You can't do the thing.
That's right. That's right.
All right. Okay. That's fascinating just in and of itself. It's like, why did you waste all that time writing that protocol and book and stuff if you can't even do it?
That's right. My invitation to Scientologists is come and confront and shatter me. You know?
Yeah. And again, too, you know, like I said, I'm curious. I'm curious about all sorts of things and ideas. And I talk to people again, like I said, I'm not trying to toot my own horn. I'm just saying from what I've learned from mentors and reading and just the way that I think fosters human well-being, which the scientists claim to try to do. I think one of those things is having open dialogue that is based on evidence, that is based on reason and these kind of things for greater human well-being. So it's like, you know, again, I have very different socio-political, religious views than a lot of my friends and family, but I still like having the conversations. I'm just like, oh, okay, tell me. And some of my friends I can recall some instances of friends that I've had. They're like, Jordan, I want to talk to you about this thing. You know, like usually it's something kind of like religious, and they'll be like, okay, you know, like, Jordan, how do you make sense of this? And how do you make sense? And I'm like, oh, okay, like this is what I think. But we can have those conversations. And going back to, it's unfortunate. I'm going to be unkind here and say they're clearly afraid and or have a lack of evidence for their beliefs where they'll be exposed, right? Like that's one of the problems. I can come on your show, or I could, you know, go to the city council. I could do these things because I have the evidence and I have the reasoning to be like, these are the things, this is how this exists. And when people don't have that, it seems like they like to say, oh no, we can't talk about it. If you could support your idea, you should be able to do it.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. You know, I was on the Lex Fridman podcast, talking about Scientology, and Lex told me he's an optimist, I think, by nature. You're familiar with Lex, right?
I saw that you had done a video with him. I'm not super familiar with him.
Okay. Then this anecdote might not mean much, but he said, you know, he was convinced that he'd be able to get David Miscavige to come on for an interview. I said, wow. David Miscavige? I said, you won't even get a Scientologist to come on. You won't even be able to get a low, mid-level media representative to come on. I said, you'll get 10 interviews with Vladimir Putin before you'll get one interview with the Scientologist. He goes, well, I disagree with you. I go, I hope I'm wrong, but I know I'm not. Lo and behold, he is interviewing Putin, and he's not gotten a Scientologist.
Oh my God. You have evidence to support your belief. And I like that argument right there that you used to, like, Putin versus, like, that's what you did, what Popper would call a risky test. Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, said that scientists should propose risky tests. Your risky test to Lex was, okay, my hypothesis is you will get Vladimir Putin on before you get David Miscavige. And then that hypothesis was tested by Lex. And then we have this evidence. So you proposed to him a risky test, get Vladimir Putin. That's a pretty risky test. You didn't say just go interview someone on the street. You gave him a tall test. And again, we have evidence that, yep, it was easier to get Vladimir Putin than David Miscavige. And the thing, going back to kind of, if we could go this direction, if you will, when I think about Scientology and I think about, I have lots of concerns about it, right? Like, you know, Natalie and I were talking about the one young man, his mother was an auditor. The young man was showing psychotic symptoms, and then he ended up stabbing her 77 times because she took him off his medication.
Yeah, his mom was actually the executive director of the Scientology organization in Buffalo, New York.
Yeah. So like we were kind of talking about these harmful ideals, but one of the things that really strikes me is like, I've read David Miscavige's wife has not been seen since, I believe, her father's funeral in 2001. Like, I am very concerned about missing people, right? Whether that is, I think about, like, in psychology, we have to take continuing education credits on how to identify victims of human trafficking, for example. Like, missing people is a concern to me. And I'm kind of concerned that, like, nobody's seen her and, like, we don't have any indication of her well-being, if that is true.
She's not really missing.
Okay.
I've done 20 videos about her being missing, but that's just to troll Scientology. So can I explain it to you? Because I actually really love explaining this.
Please do.
In the C organization, being someone's spouse means nothing. And I'll flesh this out a bit. Compare and contrast to, let's say, the head of a giant company or, the president of the United States, where being the spouse means you will travel with this person. You will be seen at their side at important events. You are known to be the spouse of this person.
Yeah.
In the C organization, and this is true at the lower levels of the Sea Org and the higher levels of the Sea Org, being David Miscavige's wife means zero. Nobody would know who you are. You would not travel with this person. You would not be by their side at events. The only thing that would cause you to be seen with this person, and this is true for Shelly, her job in the C organization was to be David Miscavige's assistant. Okay. So the only reason Leah Remini ever met David Miscavige's wife is because she traveled with him everywhere because she was his assistant, not because she was his wife. Okay. So at the highest levels of the C organization, the bases where they work are confidential in Scientology. The locations of these bases are not even known. So if David Miscavige, so the people who knew Shelly Miscavige were the people who worked with her. I, as a Scientologist, never heard, like, Scientologists in general have never seen a picture of Shelly Miscavige. If they did, she was not identified as Shelly Miscavige. She's never spoken on stage at a Scientology event. She's never issued a memo, a bulletin, a video. Shelly Miscavige her post was chairman of the board's assistant. Okay. Once David Miscavige removed her from that post, there was never any reason for Shelly Miscavige to ever be seen by a Scientologist again, except those people who work with her at the base where she works. And that's not just true for Shelly Miscavige. It's true for every single Scientology executive at the international base.
Interesting.
So my point is this, though. Even when Shelly was on her post, and she was on that post for, 15 plus years, no public Scientologist would have been able to pick Shelly Miscavige out of a lineup. No public Scientologist ever heard the name Shelly Miscavige, except for people who traveled in circles where they actually interacted with David Miscavige personally, which the only public Scientologists who personally interacted with David Miscavige would have been a celebrity like Leah Remini, who at certain events would get FaceTime with David Miscavige. And therefore he might be like, hey, here's my wife, Shelly, right? But let's say David Miscavige, when he visits a Scientology organization, he travels with an entourage of executives. If you encountered that entourage, even when Shelly was in the entourage, at no point would he introduce his wife to you. She's just there as his assistant. Okay. So the fact is, the police, now the reason I think it's fascinating that Shelly Miscavige has been disappeared is because I like to highlight it as an example of Scientology does not have the tools to fix anything. It couldn't save Tom Cruise's 3 marriages. It couldn't fix whatever David Miscavige whatever was wrong with Shelly in David Miscavige's mind. Not even David Miscavige thought he could use Scientology to fix it. He's like, fuck you. I'm taking you off of your post and I'm sending you to the Twin Peaks base so that I don't have to fucking look at your ass every day. Now, I believe he is still married to Shelly, but she works on a remote base in Twin Peaks, California. She doesn't even work at the international base. And so the point is this: if a Scientologist wouldn't be able to pick Shelly Miscavige out of a lineup, even when she was on her post, I always push back on the idea Shelly Miscavige has never been seen since. I go, seen by who? Nobody would recognize Shelly Miscavige. In fact, one of the most recent sightings of Shelly Miscavige by someone who actually knew her is a guy named Mitch Brisker, and he ran into her at a Chipotle while she was eating with two other high-level Scientology executives. And you go, so you ran into Shelly Miscavige at a Chipotle. Okay, so the point is, anyone who saw Shelly Miscavige would not know it was Shelly Miscavige.
Interesting. Right. That is really, really interesting.
Yeah. A Scientologist who saw Shelly Miscavige would not know it was Shelly Miscavige.
I'm curious. So,
one more. Hold on to that question because there's one more big kicker here.
Yeah.
Mike Rinder and Marty Rathbun are two of the highest level Scientology executives to have ever defected. They were very close personal friends with Shelly Miscavige. Shelly being taken off of her post and sent away to the Twin Peaks base happened after Mike and Marty left Scientology after Shelly was taken off of her post and sent off to the Twin Peaks base. Neither of those two people ever said one fucking word about Shelly Miscavige or her being missing or there being any concern about Shelly. None of them ever said a word about Shelly, because what happened with Shelly is not unique or remarkable. The fact that she was removed from her post happens to Scientology executives all the time. The fact that a Sea Org executive that Miscavige has fallen out of favor with Miscavige is sent off to some other base happens all the time. They never expressed 1 ounce of concern or regard for Shelly Miscavige. It wasn't until Leah Remini, who barely knew Shelly Miscavige, reported her as missing as a bit of a publicity stunt, which I'm in favor of. Like, I'm in favor of using Shelly as a publicity stunt. The problem is that now people are expected to take up the banner of, oh no, where's Shelly? We know where Shelly is. Like, where's all the other Scientology executives you haven't seen in 20 years? Right?
Yeah. That's really interesting. So this Twin Peaks,
it's a base. You can literally look it up on Google Maps. Journalists have gone there. The law enforcement has made contact with Shelly. Like, the people who tell you she's missing will also tell you where she is. So like, there are bloggers, just be a civil. I won't name them.
Yeah.
The bloggers who tell you Shelly's missing and you should be concerned for her will also take a journalist to the Twin Peaks base and say, this is where Shelly is. Then I guess she's not missing, you fucking idiot.
Yeah. If you know where, Interesting. What was it that happened to get her removed from her post?
David Miscavige had given the international Scientology executives some ridiculously impossible tasks to complete, had taken them all off of their posts, and basically said, you've got to redesign the whole international org board. He was basically, he was punishing them. He was degrading them. He was penalizing them. He was tasking them with impossible busy work. Well, what happened is one of the times that when Miscavige was off the base for an extended period of time, Shelly actually intervened to do the work all these other people were tasked with doing. And Miscavige came back and took that as a personal affront. And that was just, the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah.
I mean, the truth is, I think Miscavige was sort of losing it. He was sort of losing it. Shelly knew he was losing it. Shelly was trying to basically act as a buffer between Miscavige and the people he was essentially abusing. And Miscavige basically felt like, oh, you're siding with them? You got to go. You're out of here. You're gone. And so, there was an anecdote from a young woman who worked directly for Shelly that she saw Shelly, crying and walking to a black SUV, and the black SUV left the base. And you're like, yeah, a lot of Sea Org members cry when they're in trouble and being taken off their post. Like, the fact that she was put in an SUV is like, yeah, okay, who cares whether it was an SUV or whether it was a Honda Del Sol? Like, it doesn't matter. Like, she got in a car and she was taken to the other base. It's not a kidnapping. It's not a kidnapping,
Yeah. That's really, really interesting. And one way, I'm thinking about this, obviously, because I haven't looked into this, and I hear this, and I read it from reading some of Leah Remini's kind of stuff. And it's like to me, that is a great way to get people pissed off at Scientology. And again, whether that's good or bad or whatnot. But
I think it's great. I think it's great. I think the fact that Where is Shelly has become a meme is fantastic.
Yeah.
It's just that when I talk about it, I also talk about it in a way that's not dishonest.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. And so there's part of me that's like, okay, for anybody that's out in California, like let's see if we can, I don't know, send me a picture of her or something, or maybe I'll go out and try and meet her and be like, okay, yes, I have empirical evidence. You are you. Not saying I don't believe you, but what I'm just saying is like having that evidence, right? Of like, no, she's really not missing.
Well, and a lot of people go, if she was really there and she was really okay, why wouldn't Miscavige just, put her photo in a magazine or have her be in the background in a video? And he because Miscavige doesn't give a fuck what anyone thinks about him. Or if anything, I think he loves the fact that people are running around with a narrative that if challenged legally could be easily debunked. I think he actually loves the fact that this meme is out there and it's also false. It's better than a meme that's true, It doesn't affect Miscavige's life in any way, shape, or form that people joke about his wife being missing. It just doesn't affect his life in any way, shape, or form. And I think he's also infatuated with not feeling like anyone can force him to do anything. And he's like, I'm not going to let Leah Remini win by putting Shelly in some sort of a promo material so that people can run around and take a victory lap that they've solved the case. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I've done 100 videos about Shelly being missing. But I also explain, in every one of those videos, I actually explain, what's happened, and that Shelly being quote unquote missing is an example of how Scientology doesn't work. That's why I like talking about Shelly being missing. Miscavige couldn't even use Scientology to save his own wife and keep her on her post so that they could live happily ever after for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. Because, okay, Dianetics Scientology, it's the world we're going to clear the world and then everybody's going to live happily ever after. And it's like, it's almost like people are people. I think it's an unfortunate situation. I feel, the whole situation.
And there's another aspect of this. Realize, Shelly Miscavige might have been a kinder or gentler version of David Miscavige, but she was still one of the primary leaders of this family destroying human trafficking cult. It's not like Shelly Miscavige is in Scientology against her will.
Yeah.
Like, she's not a victim.
Yeah.
She's one of the abusers.
Yeah. Yeah.
The fact that she fell out of favor with her more abusive leader husband doesn't make her a sympathetic figure.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting too. And it's like, there's part of me that kind of wants to push back a little bit about like, what are the maintaining factors, again, keeping all these people. And I'm not saying she is a great person, but it would be interesting to see like, what are some of the influences keeping some of these people, and especially the higher ups of staying in? Because even then, it's like,
Can I tell you?
Yeah.
Shelly Miscavige was practically raised by L. Ron Hubbard. She started working for Scientology when she was like 11, 12, 13, something like this.
Oh, wow.
On the ship with L. Ron Hubbard. Shelly Miscavige believes that L. Ron Hubbard is coming back. Shelly Miscavige believes in Scientology. Shelly Miscavige believes in the mission of Scientology. Even if she knows Scientology is not accomplishing its aims, she believes that eventually L. Ron Hubbard is going to come back. And if she were to leave, that would be abandoning L. Ron Hubbard. Like, she's a believer.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
interesting.
And so, like, when I say she's not a victim, everyone in Scientology is to some extent a victim.
Yeah. Yep.
But someone, if they wanted to really go far out there, would say, well, doesn't that apply to David Miscavige?
Yeah.
Why is he the only one in Scientology who's not?
Yeah. Interesting. No, I appreciate the background. And like I said, I'll have to check out some of your other videos, because I do find that like really fascinating. And then two, clearly, Leah Remini was pissed off, and it's like, okay, well, again, and then this whole
now Leah Remini says it's my missing friend. It was my missing friend, and you go, then why were you guys writing letters to each other in the age of cell phones? Like, Shelly Miscavige was being nice to you because you were a Scientology celebrity. Did you ever go over to her house? No. Did she ever go over to your house? No. Did you guys ever go shopping together? No. You ever go to the spa together? No. You ever take a day off together? No. Then what definition of friend are we using here?
Yeah.
She sent you a Christmas gift? Okay, how many other celebrities did she send Christmas gifts to? Shelly Miscavige was treating you how she was treating you because she was chairman of the board's assistant and you were a Scientology celebrity. And if you were her friend, Mike Rinder was also her friend, Marty Rathman was also her friend, they never reported her missing. So why 8, 9, 10 years later, like you reported her missing after you hadn't spoken to her for 10 years? Well,
yeah.
I feel like if you were really friends and she was really missing, it wouldn't have taken you 10 years to file that report. So
yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Wow. A lot going on.
So, but it sounds like I'm bothered when people say she's missing. I'm not. I actually love it when people say that she's missing.
Yeah, but to be able to provide the context of like this is actually what this is. Yeah, that's fascinating.
And I guess one of the things, if I sound like I've got a slight edge to myself on this subject, there are people in my community who think it's not okay to explain how she's not really missing. And I'm like, you guys can you can ride that fucking train if you want. I'm not going to ride that train. I'm going to explain what's the real story is interesting enough.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Well, and then too, going back to this idea of, I don't know, truth and honesty, right? Like I would rather, you know, again, like even I'm thinking about like in my experience, like if I was aware of, you know, I'll give you an example of like I'm trying to draw this analogy between exposing something and telling the truth. So for example, the American Psychiatric Association initially was somehow involved in training CIA operatives to torture people in Guantanamo Bay. The American Psychiatric Association body and other people found out about it, so they pulled out. And they're like, okay, not Gucci. We can't do that. Then 2 psychologists, I forget what their names are. I believe you could Google, you can find there was 2 psychologists from the American Psychological Association who stepped in and trained, you know, interrogators in interrogation techniques that were primarily used at Guantanamo Bay. That was clearly a thing, like a conspiracy theory, a thing. And I will be the first one to say, like, this actually happened, right? Like I think the truth of the matter that this was an event that happened is way better than just sweeping it under the rug, right? And now, I forget what year it was, but anybody can go online and Google the American Psychological Association's ethics code. And there is a subsection that says psychologists will not aid in torturing and interrogation. I wonder where that clause came from. Well, it came from when the American Psychological Association was exposed for participating and sending down psychologists to do this thing. I think that's a fascinating story. And I'll be, like I said, I'm being honest about it. Anybody can look this up. But I'm trying to draw that analogy kind of like to what you said of being truthful with people. Yes, the American Psychological Association was involved in this. That is, I mean, it's bad, obviously, you know, training people to torture. And I mean, we can make all these moral arguments and stuff. But again, I'm trying to draw this analogy to your story about like, no, we should talk about it. If we know the truth, we should talk about it.
Sure, totally. And, you know, there's one other very prominent, I could say this for a number of Scientology executives, but one in particular, he was famous in Scientology. His name is Guillaume Leserve, and his post was Executive Director International, and it was at least believed that he was put on that post by L. Ron Hubbard himself, whether that's true or not. This guy hasn't been seen in 20 years. So what's more interesting, that one of Scientology's most visible and famous executives has not been seen in 20 years, or that David Miscavige's wife, who almost nobody knew and nobody could pick out of a lineup, hasn't been seen in 20 years? They're both interesting, but you only, poor Shelly. Where's Shelly? Where the fuck is Guillaume? No one cares about Guillaume. No one, where's Ray Mithoff? You know, no one's seen these. So the most famous high-level Scientology executives, no one's seen them in 20 years. But everyone cares about Shelly because because of the missing persons report. Shelly, it's not that nobody should ever be concerned about Shelly.
Yeah.
It's that if that concern was as well-founded as some people want to make it seem, they would have the same concern for the other Scientology executives for whom that's true. But there's zero concern there. So both can't be true.
Kind of drawing that discrepancy of like, well, this is a trend, right? So like, why stop with this one person when there are these other people who haven't been seen? as well. Yeah, that is really, really interesting.
And especially when many media organizations have literally been escorted to the base where Shelly works by one of the main guys who says she's missing and says, here she is. This is where she works. It's like, then why do you keep saying she's missing, dude?
Yeah. That seems contradictory. Like, what do you mean she's missing if she's...
Because her family hasn't spoken to her. Wait a second. You mean family members you're speaking to haven't spoken to her?
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that you keep saying these family members speak to you would literally be the reason Shelly doesn't talk to them. Right?
Yeah.
So it's like, you mean Shelly hasn't been seen by anyone who A, recognized her, and B, told you about it.
Yeah.
But nobody would recognize her, and almost nobody who would tell you about it.
Yeah. Interesting. So it's kind of like what you're arguing is like, to a degree of like, okay, let's say my spouse worked at a company and no one had ever met me, right? Oh, Jordan's missing. We've never met, like they would never even recognize me because I've never met them before, and then kind of made a hoopla. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, I'm glad to have some more information on that, so I can, not be super worried, these things that she's totally
missing. Totally.
Well, so I appreciate that.
Before we wrap up, there's one thing I wanted to, because I haven't even asked you about it, and we're 2.5 hours in.
Oh yeah.
You described you introduced yourself at the city council meeting as a master's level psychologist.
Yep.
So what does that mean exactly?
Okay, that's a great question too. So I'm going to give you a long kind of explanation. According to the American Psychological Association, they are a doctoral level organization, meaning that the American Psychological Association as a body only recognizes people with PhDs or what are called PsyDs, which is a doctor of psychology. However, various states can grant someone with a master's degree as and license them as a type of psychologist. So for example, I know that at the very least, half of the states in the union recognize some sort of master's level psychologist. In the state of Michigan, if you have a master's degree, and you pass the licensing exam, we are considered limited licensed psychologists, or LLPs. And what that means is that we cannot practice independently. What that means is I have a supervisor who is a licensed psychologist who reviews my work, who reviews my reports, who reviews my treatment of clients. Now, there is a movement to change that, because master's level psychologists are the only treatment providers that have to remain under supervision the way that laws and everything is currently written for the entirety of their career. Right now, the American Psychological Association is trying to figure out a way to grant independent practice status for master's level psychologists throughout the nation. And from my understanding, they're actually using Michigan, our state laws, as a model, because according to what I've read, Michigan has the largest number of master's level psychologists.
Wow.
So technically it would be unethical for me to say I am a psychologist. I have to identify myself as a master's level psychologist, so not to as mislead people. So that's why, it's okay. Yeah. So that's why
so anyone who is a licensed psychologist, is generally speaking a PhD.
They either they must have a PhD in psychology or a closely related field, and pass the EPPP, and have 2,000 hours of postgraduate supervision, or a PsyD. But a master's degree psychologist cannot ethically refer to themselves as a psychologist. So I try to be ethical, so that's why I always announce myself as, yes, I'm a master's degree level or master's level psychologist, or a limited licensed psychologist.
Wow. So educationally speaking, is the only difference between a PhD psychologist and a psychiatrist that the psychiatrist is also an MD?
Yes. So with some other different, but yes, basically it is that a psychiatrist is a medical doctor. A psychologist is not a medical doctor. Now, there are some states in the union that allow PhD licensed psychologists to prescribe medications. I believe Louisiana is one of them, and there's a handful of others. Now they have to get, in order for a psychologist to prescribe medication in those states, they must also obtain a master's degree in like psychopharmacology, I believe, and they have to pass a test and like do some additional things. But so again, there are a few states that allow psychologists to prescribe medications, but they are not psychiatrists or medical doctors. Yeah.
I've always sort of wondered, like, so to be a psychiatrist and to have that MD, that's like full blown med school, or is there some like abbreviated version that they do?
Yeah, no, my understanding, again, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't fully speak to that. My understanding is, right, well, you'd be an MD or a DO, doctor of
osteopathy.
Yeah. So either one of those, but my understanding is like they go through all of the medical school as like a gastroenterologist would. But what happens, to my understanding, is like when you do your residency, right? So they just tend to specialize, be like, oh, instead of being gastroenterology, I'm going to go into psychiatry. So they get their residency and more of their schooling in that path, but they're still taking all of those medical school classes.
I guess the reason why this was always a head scratcher for me is I'm like, wait a second. You're going to go through all the time and trouble of going through med school, but instead of being a doctor, yeah. I'm like, wouldn't you make more money being a doctor than doing all the extra education to be a psychiatrist? I was like, I don't get it.
Yeah. There here's the thing too, right? Like in the mental health field, we have numerous professionals that are mental health professionals. So, we have psychologists, we have psychiatrists, we have counselors, we have social workers, we have marriage and family therapists. So, it gets kind of confusing to people in general because they're like, don't you all do the same thing? Basically, yeah. I mean, that's supposed to be the idea, right? I could go on my arguments of really, I believe it has more to do with your philosophy and like views of human nature and of science and scientifically informed practice and those kind of things. But yeah, if you get down kind of into the weeds, some people try to fight like, oh, this is different. I mean, I'll give you a historical anecdote, if you will, or a story. So for the longest time, it was psychiatrists who provided psychotherapy before about the 1980s, when we saw the biologicalization of mental health going to the providing pills model. Before, historically, it was psychiatrists who were doing psychotherapy, and psychologists were primarily doing testing. So testing as far as like intellectual assessments and personality assessments. And then over the years, we started seeing psychologists kind of infringe, if you will, on the turf of psychiatrists, where like, no, we can do therapy too. And then, like around the 80s, the psychiatrists started going more towards prescribing medicine. So if you look at like the history of like just mental health care, it's really fascinating to see how these different professions have kind of sought their turf. And that's how I look at it now, is kind of some turf fighting and where each other's boundaries are, if you will.
That's amazing. That is interesting. Do you know what you might make for great YouTube? If you actually put your hands on the how to Dianetics video and watched that and like broke down, it's not a long video.
Okay.
But Dianetics is a pretty hard book to read, and it's kind of it's a slog. It's a tough slog. But they've got the how to Dianetics video, and it would be interesting to get your thoughts on what's in that video.
Yeah. Is it on the Scientology YouTube page?
You can probably put your hands on it in a various bookstore here or a bookstore there. I'll try to see if I can figure out the easiest way to get a copy of that. And
Okay.
because I don't know if it's all on YouTube or not, because it's something Scientology sells. I don't know if they would have put it on YouTube.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Someone might have put it on YouTube.
Yeah, no, that sounds interesting. And I mean, like I said, I pulled various quotes here, of L. Ron Hubbard throughout his writings. And when you say it's a slog to get through, it's hard for me to read stuff that I know is already empirically false. Yeah. But you look at the things that he was saying in some of these quotes. I'm just like, how am I going to read a book that says, it's pronounced, is it Theatin? I forget. Thetan. So L. Ron Hubbard.
That's not Dianetics, though.
No, this isn't Dianetics specifically, but as far as like a pseudoscientific ideal, that'd be hard for me to read. I have this quote here from Hubbard, 1977, page 33. The thetan is associated with its own electrical field. And I'm like, I'm not a physicist and I'm not, but how do you make that claim? How would you investigate that? Like, how are you saying that this thing has its very own electrical field aside from like a potential human electrical field? Like, so reading stuff like that makes it really hard for me to read. So I'm just saying I can appreciate with what you're saying. Read this.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
He also says that a thetan is a static, has no wavelength, and is no position, and has matter, energy, space, or time, but it magically has its own electrical field. So,
all right. That's not contradictory at all. Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I just like all of these ideas. And the other thing too that kind of going back to the Dianetics book, my understanding is, because I was, before the city council meeting, I was doing some more research into it. It's like, okay, he had the 1950 publication, but he was consistently revising it. And I read in the scientific literature, some people are like, yeah, the 1950 version is completely different from the 2007 version
of the book Dianetics. So there's the original book Dianetics, which Scientologists call Book 1.
Okay.
Then there's like a Scientologized version of it called New Era Dianetics. What's interesting is that what's in the book Dianetics is only considered an introductory route to Scientology. It's actually not even how Dianetics is audited in Scientology. So at this point, it's almost like curiosa, sort of like it's just a way to get people interested, do some, but like, Scientology is about achieving the state of clear.
Yeah.
You're not even allowed to achieve the state of clear using the Book 1 Dianetics procedure anymore. They don't even consider that valid anymore. And you're like, then why is it there? It's there because they're not allowed to get rid of it. L. Ron Hubbard wrote it, and it's going to be there forever.
Interesting. Yeah, because then I started reading about these OT stages, and I'm like, oh my God, like y'all just kind of just kept going with this whole thing. Okay, like that's really interesting.
And what's funny is that in Dianetics, in Scientology, you have to go through dozens and dozens, hundreds and hundreds of hours of Dianetics auditing before you're allowed to achieve the state of clear. And yet on the upper confidential OT levels, when you're telepathically communicating with these beings that are stuck to you, your goal is actually to get them to achieve the state of clear. But you do it with just like 2 commands. And you're like, wait a second. We normal level beings, it takes us hundreds of hours, if not thousands of hours to achieve the state of clear. Yeah. But these sick, diseased alien beings, they can do it in 2 commands?
Yeah.
Something's not right here.
Yeah. That doesn't seem to add up. Well, and Natalie was explaining to me too, of I believe she was saying the idea is like, you got the reactive mind, and you're supposed to overcome the reactive mind, right? And basically you just tell yourself, if I'm remembering what she said correctly, but you're just like, yeah, I'm no longer under the influence of the reactive mind. And then it's like you've achieved this like enlightenment. It's like, wait a minute, like why didn't you just tell people that from the start?
That's right. There's something called the clear cognition. Now in Scientology, cognition means a realization about life. And in an auditing session, and it is supposed to be a Dianetics auditing session, not just a Scientology auditing session. Okay. You are supposed to, you're supposed to say these words, but this is like one of the most highly confidential secrets in Scientology. It's more confidential than the Xenu stuff. The magical words that you're supposed to say are, I have just realized that I have been creating my own reactive mind all along.
Yeah.
And I'm not doing it anymore. Ta-da! I'm clear.
Yeah. To me, it's like, okay, if Scientology operates from the premise that our job is to clear the entire human species, why would you then not give them the tool in those words to then clear and then bring about paradise?
So the way that they would explain that is it's not saying the words that brings about the condition. Experiencing the condition is evidenced by someone expressing the words. And so feeding someone the cognition doesn't give them the state. That's what they would say.
Interesting. Okay. Yep. All right. I guess.
Don't think about it too deeply. You might realize you're in a cult.
Yep. That is really interesting. And then too, how you defined cognition. So the way you define cognition is not the scientifically accepted definition of cognition. And
Right.
Natalie and I were talking about that too. And that's a characteristic of pseudoscience, is jargon, right? Is like L. Ron Hubbard. So, being a thetan, right, is like, oh, he's talking kind of about a soul. We'll just call it a soul. Thetan. Sorry.
Thetan.
Yes. Thetan. So it's like, okay, thetan. He's kind of talking about a soul. Again, it seemed like was kind of, so just call it that, right? Or like some of these other terms that he came up with. It's like some of them we already have words for. Some of them he clearly created. But those are characteristics of a pseudoscience. Whereas, like, to me, right, it's like, oh, Jordan, define this term. It's like I should have to do that and be able to do that. So that was another thing that I found really interesting. And honestly, I think it was either one of your videos or one of Natalie's videos where I kind of hinted on that as well, of like just creating your own language. And that also acts as an insulator, right? Well, they don't have the knowledge and experience to critique our words and our thoughts because they're from the outside. They don't really understand. Well, as a scientist, I want people to understand, right? Kind of going back to the earlier parts of our conversation.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'll tell you what, why don't we wrap it up here? Okay. This has been incredibly fun. We should do some more chats together.
Yeah.
Maybe I want to see if I can get my hands on a Dianetics how-to video.
Yeah, that'd be sweet.
Because man, would it be fun to break that down with your from your professional master's level psychologist background.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, hey, I'm going to try to get this published today or tomorrow. I'll record a little intro and then I'll send you a link when it's all ready. And anytime you want to have a chat about anything else relating to any of this, just let me know and we'll do it.
Yeah. Send me, just let me know. And it was a pleasure. Thank you again for having me on. And I was honored when I heard you're like, oh yeah, how we call, when you heard that I called out, oh, he said science in, the Dianetics book. Like I really appreciate that. I'm like, okay, Aaron gets it. So thanks again for the conversation and having me on. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to future conversations.
My pleasure. Looking forward to it.
Okay, if you want to see my rock and roll songs, click right on this guitar. And if you want to see a different one of my videos, then you could click right inside here. If you have subscribed or not, subscribe right here. Bye.